You arrive just before dawn. The streets of Rome are still dark, only the dim orange glow of old lamps flickering off cobblestones. The crowds are gone. The clatter of tour buses and the murmur of pilgrims has not yet begun. Just birds and the occasional creak of an old shutter. You pass under the ancient archways, and there it is, Vatican City. Small, still asleep. 44 hectares of stone marble and silence. It is the smallest country on earth, but it holds more stories than any kingdom ever ruled. Somewhere within these walls, beneath the grand basilicas, behind the heavy wooden doors, and beneath the mosaic ceilings, there is a room. Or maybe many rooms, shelves stretching endlessly, documents written by popes and kings, by emperors and heretics, letters never delivered, secrets never meant to be seen. It's called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, but most still whisper its old name, the Secret Archive. For over 4 centuries, no outsider stepped foot inside without written papal permission. Even today, only a select handful of scholars are allowed in, escorted, monitored, and restricted to a few requests at a time. You don't browse, you don't explore. You ask for a specific document, and even then, you may not be told if it exists. But it's not just the security that makes the archive mysterious. It's what people think is down there. Documents from the trial of Jesus, letters from Pontius Pilate, the lost books of the Bible, plans for a machine that sees through time, maps to hidden tombs, reports of celestial visitations, records of sins so forbidden only the Pope himself is allowed to read them. And deeper still, stories, rumors that the Vatican is not just the guardian of holy tradition, but of history's most dangerous truths. You stand at the gates of this tiny country and wonder if someone controlled not just theology, but time itself. If someone had written the spiritual DNA of the modern world, decided which truths we get to read and which ones stay buried, what would they look like? They might look like a library. They might look like this. So tonight, we won't walk the Vatican by daylight. We won't follow the crowds or stand in line for a guided tour. No, tonight, we'll go deeper past the gift shops and the stained glass, past the prayers and the politics. Down into the vaults, into the shadows, into the stories too strange to teach in Sunday school and too dangerous to be dismissed entirely. Because behind these stone walls lie 2,000 years of questions, and not all of them are waiting to be answered. Some, they say, are waiting to be forgotten, but not by us. So settle in. Let the world outside fade away. You won't need a passport, just curiosity. We'll move slowly, quietly, like someone turning a key in an old lock. One whisper at a time. This is where the mysteries begin. It doesn't look like much from the outside. Tucked behind courtyards and stone hallways within Vatican City, the entrance to one of the most mysterious places on earth isn't marked by guards in armor or torches in sconces. There's no dramatic staircase, no elaborate inscription carved into marble. Just a heavy wooden door with a small bronze plaque. Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican's secret archive. For centuries, this was the beating heart of Catholic memory, though even that phrase, secret archive, is a bit of a misnomer. In Latin, secretum doesn't mean hidden so much as private. But over the years, the name became more than literal. It became symbolic. A place not just of protection, but of restriction. Not just of scholarship, but of silence. And that silence has echoed through history. This archive holds more than 12 centuries of documents, some of the oldest on Earth. The shelves, if laid end to end, would stretch longer than Manhattan. Over 50 miles of files, more than 85,000 volumes, all stored in climate-controlled vaults, guarded day and night by Swiss guards and Vatican security. Visitors aren't allowed to roam. Access is granted to fewer than 100 scholars per year. Even then, only very specific documents may be requested. No browsing, no photography, no digital copies unless approved in advance, and even then, only a few pages at a time. It's less a library than a vault. So why all the secrecy? The official answer is simple preservation. Many of the documents are ancient, written on fragile parchment or early paper vulnerable to light, air, and time. But that's not the only reason. The Vatican isn't just preserving its history, it's curating it. Carefully, selectively. Which stories are told and which remain locked away. And it's in that quiet gap between knowledge and access where the mystery begins. We know some of what's in there. The archives contain official church documents, papal bulls, correspondence with kings and emperors, records of excommunications and canonizations, court transcripts, tax records, and internal memos. There are letters from Michelangelo Galileo and Henry VIII. There's even a letter from Abraham Lincoln to Pope Pius IX. It's a timeline of Western civilization written from behind the most powerful altar in the world. But that's just the surface. There are entire rooms where no scholar has ever stepped. Files too old, or too sacred, or too dangerous to be viewed. And the archive's catalog system. Even that is partially classified. In some cases, scholars are told the general subject of a folder, but not what's actually inside. In others, the files are labeled only by year, with no summary, no description, and no explanation. A single folder might say Anno Domini 1242, Miscellanea. That's it. What's in there? We don't know. And that's the point. The secrecy surrounding the archives has inspired countless rumors over the years, some outlandish, others chillingly plausible. Some say the Vatican possesses the original trial transcript of Jesus Christ, recorded by Roman officials and kept out of public view for 2,000 years. Others speak of letters written by Pontius Pilate to Emperor Tiberius, explaining why he condemned the Nazarene carpenter to death. Some claim the Vatican has the earliest unedited Gospels texts that tell a different version of Jesus' story, one more human, more complex perhaps, even more dangerous to doctrine. Then there are darker whispers of forbidden books, heretical gospels, apocalyptic visions that the Church has locked away for fear of the chaos they might cause. One particularly persistent legend tells of a manuscript discovered during an exorcism written in an ancient language no one could identify, describing beings not of this world and stars that would not be discovered by science for another 600 years. Another rumor speaks of the chronovisor, a device allegedly hidden in the archives that allows its user to view past events as if watching a scene through time itself. A divine television, some have called it. A cosmic sin. And yet the Vatican neither confirms nor denies. That silence, that quiet refusal to explain, has only fed the legends. But perhaps the most telling mystery isn't about aliens or lost gospels or devices from another era. Perhaps it's simpler. Perhaps the real secret is how power operates not with noise, but with stillness. Not with fire, but with shadows. The Vatican Archive is a reminder of that. A monument not just to what we remember, but to what we choose to forget. Because truth is power, and whoever controls the past controls the narrative. Think about it. No other religious institution on earth has its own sovereign state, its own intelligence network, its own post office, its own media arm, and its own secret archive of global history. No government has kept records so long, so guarded, so deliberate. The Church hasn't just chronicled the rise and fall of empires, it's survived them. It has outlasted Rome, Byzantium, the Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, and the digital age. Through it all, the archive has stood silent, waiting. The doors may seem sealed, but something inside still breathes. Each page is a whisper, each shelf a boundary between the seen and the unseen. And while the Vatican claims its secrecy is for preservation, perhaps that's only part of the truth, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with knowledge is keep it just out of reach. So, as we prepare to descend into these 52 miles of memory, ask yourself, what would a world look like if one place, one institution, held the final copies of history's most dangerous truths? And what happens if those truths are never read again? It's easy to think of the Vatican archive as just a place of ancient scrolls, brittle Latin texts, and long-forgotten dogmas. But what's most unsettling isn't what's ancient, it's what's modern. Or rather, what's personal. Because tucked between theological treatises and papal decrees are letters. Thousands of them. Maybe hundreds of thousands. Some no longer than a paragraph, some the length of books. Some from kings, others from scientists. Some penned by visionaries who changed the world. Others by people whose names history never remembered. They were letters of confession, desperation, politics, and sometimes love. But here's the thing, many of them were never answered, and some were never even read. You might wonder why the Vatican of all places would keep these letters. The Church, after all, is a place of prayer and doctrine, not a post office. But for centuries, people wrote to the Pope the way others wrote to God. They asked for forgiveness, for guidance, for intercession in matters of war, poverty, heartbreak. Because the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was the head of a global empire, the man who crowned kings, the man who could excommunicate a nation, the man who could say yes or nothing at all. And so the letters came. Michelangelo, for example, wrote to the Vatican not only about his masterpieces, but about being overworked and underpaid. In one letter, he described how the Pope's demands were exhausting him physically and spiritually. "I am not well. I cannot continue," he wrote, carving beauty for a church that didn't always pay its artists in grace. Galileo's letters are even more tragic. A brilliant mind caught in the crosshairs of dogma. He pleaded with the Church not to reject his findings, not to condemn science itself. "I do not ask you to change your faith," he wrote, "only to consider that truth and scripture may speak in more than one voice." The archive holds those words, locked away. Then there's the letter from King Henry VIII of England, who asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a request that would eventually split the Christian world in two. The letter sits there still, its refusal echoing through centuries of Anglican and Catholic divide. And even across oceans, the Vatican's influence stretched. During the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln wrote to Pope Pius IX. The contents of that exchange are still debated, but the letter itself remains sealed in the archives. Some say it was diplomatic, a gesture of goodwill. Others believe it carried deeper weight, perhaps addressing slavery or seeking spiritual counsel in a time of national fracture. These letters are more than historical curiosities. They are moments frozen in wax and ink, intersections of faith, fear, and human fragility. They represent the parts of history where hearts reached out, and sometimes the silence replied louder than any voice. But for every letter we know about, there are thousands more whose authors are unknown. Because for generations, people believed, truly believed, that writing to the Vatican could change their lives. A peasant in 15th century France begging for food. A mother in 1920s Ireland pleading for help to find her lost child. A scientist during the Enlightenment era offering proof that threatened to upend Scripture. All of them wrote, and many were never answered. But the letters were kept. Why? Perhaps the Church saw them as historical record, or maybe as burdens too great to throw away. A spiritual archive of humanity's hopes and fears. Or perhaps they kept them because some of them weren't just stories, some were warnings. One often whispered rumor describes a letter from a World War II priest stationed in Poland who claimed to have witnessed early signs of mass executions. He wrote to the Vatican describing trainloads of people, villages gone overnight, strange orders from the occupying forces. He begged for the Church to speak out. The letter was never acknowledged. But it exists. Another letter, supposedly from an Italian monk in the early 1900s, describes a vision dreamlike symbolic of a new kind of war. Machines that fly like birds. Cities turned to ash in seconds. He claimed the vision came after days of fasting and prayer. The letter, if it exists, is said to be filed in a drawer simply labeled Private Warnings. Some letters never even made it to their destination. Smuggled, stolen, intercepted. During the Cold War, both the CIA and the KGB reportedly tried to access correspondence between the Vatican and Eastern Bloc nations. Not just political exchanges, but spiritual ones. Because even in atheistic regimes, many believed the church still had eyes and maybe even ears behind every wall. If faith could travel across the Iron Curtain, so could secrets. And if those secrets were written down, they'd be here. In the end, it's not just the letters themselves that matter. It's the fact that the church kept them, preserved them, filed them away, knowing that someday someone might read them. Or not. That power, the ability to hold someone's truth and decide what to do with it, is immense. It's also quietly terrifying. Because what would you write if you knew the most powerful religious institution in the world would read your words? And what would it mean if they didn't? Some scholars have argued that the archive's most valuable contents aren't dogmas or doctrines, but these letters. Because they show the church not as an institution, but as a mirror, reflecting not just theology, but humanity. You see, history often teaches us through kings and battles and revolutions, but sometimes it's the quietest voices that whisper the loudest truths. A letter from a forgotten monk, a plea from a tired artist, a scribbled prayer from someone who had nothing left but hope. They may not have changed the world, but they're still here, still sealed, still waiting. And perhaps someday when the archive's final doors are opened, we won't just find forgotten doctrines or revelations. We'll find something even more powerful. A sentence, a name, a thought that was never meant to disappear. Let's walk into a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of a locked vault or a sealed envelope, but the silence of erasure. The kind where something was once there and now isn't. Not because it was never written, but because someone decided the world would be better off forgetting. We're talking about the Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. It's something many people never question. The Bible just is. You're handed one in Sunday school. You hear verses quoted at weddings, funerals, in courtroom oaths, or from politicians on podiums. It feels final, complete, unchanging. But that wasn't always the case. In the early centuries of Christianity, there wasn't one book. There were many. Dozens of texts circulated among different communities, some written in Greek, others in Aramaic or Coptic, some short, others sprawling, some focused on Jesus the divine, others on Jesus the man. Some were mystical, others were blunt, almost journalistic. They told different stories, emphasized different moments, offered different meanings. Some called him the Son of God, some called him a teacher of wisdom, and some just asked questions. One of the most famous of these is the Gospel of Thomas. It's not a narrative like Matthew or Luke. It's a collection of sayings, short, poetic, often cryptic. In one line, Jesus says, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift a stone, and you will find me." No miracles, no crucifixion, just riddles. Spiritual, strange, and strangely beautiful. Another is the Gospel of Mary, attributed to Mary Magdalene. In it, she describes visions and teachings Jesus supposedly gave her in private. Teachings the male disciples doubt. Peter questions her authority, but she stands firm. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? The Gospel ends with a quiet defiance. It's been called one of the earliest feminist texts in religious history. Then there's the Gospel of Judas, discovered in a cave in Egypt in the 1970s, though believed to have been written centuries earlier. In it, Judas isn't a villain. He's the only one who understands Jesus' true mission. Jesus tells him to betray him, not as a punishment, but as a necessary step in his divine plan. It flips the entire betrayal story on its head. Light becomes shadow. Shadow becomes light. There's also the infancy Gospel of James, which tells stories of Mary's childhood and the miraculous birth of Jesus in more elaborate, almost mythical language. It's where the idea of Mary's perpetual virginity comes from, an idea that shaped Catholic doctrine for centuries, even though this gospel was never canonized. And these are just a few. Scholars have cataloged over 30 separate gospels that were excluded from the Bible. Some we know only by name. Others survive in fragments. A few, like the ones above, were preserved in full, but hidden for nearly 2,000 years in jars, caves, and dust. So why were they excluded? The answer, like most things in history, isn't simple. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity. What had once been a scattered, persecuted faith suddenly became a matter of empire. And with empire comes order, consensus, control. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD wasn't just about theology. It was about unification. Bishops gathered to decide what Christianity was, and by extension, what it wasn't. A few decades later, the canon was formalized. 4 Gospels were chosen: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The rest were deemed apocryphal, heretical, dangerous. Some were burned, others buried, many simply forgotten. But not by everyone. Some of these texts survived in the hands of desert monks, hidden away from imperial reach. Others were preserved by Gnostic communities who believed salvation came not from obedience, but from inner knowledge. Their Jesus wasn't a sacrificial lamb. He was a revealer of secrets, a guide to awakening the divine spark within. To the Church, this was blasphemy. To many modern readers, it's something else entirely intriguing. Today, the Vatican considers most of these texts to be non-canonical, which is a gentle way of saying, don't trust them. But some scholars believe the full versions of these Gospels, perhaps in older, unedited forms, may still exist sealed within the Vatican archives. If true, they could offer profound new insights into the earliest days of Christianity. Imagine reading a version of the Gospel where Jesus laughs during the crucifixion, not because he's mocking pain, but because he transcends it. Or one where Mary Magdalene is described not as a disciple, but as a partner. Or a gospel that questions whether Jesus died at all. These aren't just theological tweaks, they're seismic shifts. They force us to ask, who decided what was true? Who decided what version of Jesus we were meant to follow? And what if other versions, softer, stranger, more human, were simply shelved? That's the quiet danger of a locked archive. It's not just hiding blasphemy, it's hiding options. Narratives that didn't win the vote. Voices that didn't have the power. Paths that might have led to different expressions of faith, more mystical, more inclusive, less hierarchical. And yet, there's something comforting about that too, because it means faith is bigger than the walls that contain it. It means the spiritual imagination of early Christians was vast, wild, and endlessly curious. Not every story was shaped for clarity. Some were meant to be questioned. Not every version of Jesus was the same. Some were healer, some teacher, some mystery. And perhaps, just perhaps, there's room for all of them. Today, many of these Gospels have been translated and published. You can buy them, read them, sit with them in the quiet of your own home. But the original scrolls, the earliest versions, the fragile papyri that once sat in the hands of saints and scribes, are still sealed away. Not because they're dangerous, but because they still have something to say. And maybe that's what the Vatican fears most. Not heresy, but awakening. A sentence that turns the story inside out. A forgotten name that reshapes everything. A Jesus who still surprises us 2,000 years later. His life by modern standards was brief. Just over 3 decades on earth. Only 3 years of public ministry. And less than a single day between sentencing and death. And yet, no figure in history has shaped more art, more war, more nations, or more laws than Jesus of Nazareth. His teachings redefined morality. His story rewrote calendars. His name has been spoken in more tongues, in more temples, and with more passion, both adoration and opposition, than almost any in human memory. And yet, for all the reverence and ritual, so much of his life remains silent. The Gospels offer stories, parables. They speak of miracles and metaphors, teachings and betrayals. But they're not written like modern biographies. They don't give us dates, documents, or physical descriptions. We know almost nothing about what Jesus looked like, how his voice sounded, what he did in the years before his public ministry. We don't even know exactly when he was born. It's a paradox, a man so deeply embedded in the foundation of Western civilization, yet so elusive in the historical record. And that absence, those quiet gaps, have left room for speculation, for mystery, for questions that echo through time like unanswered prayers. Did Jesus ever write anything down himself? Were there official Roman records of his trial? Are there personal diaries, letters, or eyewitness accounts that simply never made it into the Bible? Some believe the answers may lie beneath the Vatican. Let's begin with what we do know. Outside the New Testament, there are a few ancient references to Jesus by Roman historians. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, briefly mentions that a man called Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate. Josephus, a Jewish historian, refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. These are important, but they're sparse. 2 or 3 sentences at most. A footnote to a faith. Everything else we know comes from the Gospels written decades after Jesus' death by authors who never met him. They were composed not to document events, but to inspire belief. They were acts of worship, not investigation. Which raises the question, were there other records? If the Roman Empire kept meticulous notes about tax payments and military orders, wouldn't someone somewhere have recorded the execution of a man accused of insurrection during Passover? Wouldn't Pilate, an administrator of a tense, volatile province, have written to his superiors about such a politically sensitive case? Some legends say he did. One of the most enduring stories tells of a letter written by Pontius Pilate to Emperor Tiberius explaining the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. In one version, he pleads with the emperor, expressing doubt and even guilt. In another, he offers a cold, bureaucratic defense. A few versions even suggest that Pilate believed Jesus was divine, or at least extraordinary. These letters have never been authenticated, but they've never been disproven either. There's also the matter of the lost years, the nearly 2-decade gap between Jesus' childhood and the start of his ministry. At age 12, he debates with rabbis in the temple. At age 30, he is baptized by John. And between those moments, nothing. No Gospels, no letters, no travel records. Where was he? Some say he remained in Nazareth studying scripture and working as a carpenter. Others suggest he traveled east to Egypt, Persia, or even India. There he might have studied under mystics, priests, or monks. Stories from Buddhist monasteries in the Himalayas describe a holy man from the West arriving in robes teaching in parables before disappearing again. It may sound outlandish, but when the silence is this deep, even whispers echo loudly. And some believe the Vatican knows more than it has ever revealed. For centuries, the Church has sent missionaries across the globe. Some were scholars, others were spies. They collected texts, artifacts, rumors. In Egypt, scrolls were discovered. In India, oral traditions. Some may have made their way back to Rome, filed, translated, stored, and perhaps suppressed. Because if there are documents suggesting Jesus studied under Eastern teachers, or preached doctrines outside Jewish tradition, or saw himself not as a Messiah, but as a mystic, that would challenge the heart of Christian theology. And the Vatican, as keeper of that theology, might have decided some truths were best left in silence. But there's another, more radical theory. that Jesus didn't die on the cross. This idea isn't just the plot of mystery novels. It appears in Islamic texts, in Eastern legends, even in a few Christian fringe writings. The Quran, for example, states that Jesus was not crucified, but that it appeared so, that he was taken up by God alive. Some stories claim he survived the crucifixion, was cared for in secret, and later fled possibly to Egypt, possibly beyond. What if a document exists hidden in the archive that describes that escape? A Roman soldier's account, a scroll from a sympathizer, a letter smuggled out of Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Even a single sentence authenticated could change the faith of billions. But it's not just about death, it's about words. Did Jesus ever write anything himself? He was literate. As a Jewish man of his time, he would have studied the Torah, known Hebrew and Aramaic. The Gospels show him reading aloud, quoting scripture. So why have no writings of his own survived? Some claim they did. There are whispers of a short letter written by Jesus in his own hand, given to a disciple or a temple scribe. A meditation, a farewell, a teaching written in his own words. Some legends say it was found during the Crusades, hidden in a box beneath a church. Others claim it was discovered in a cave buried near Qumran and quietly transferred to the Vatican under diplomatic seal. What would such a letter say? Would it echo the Gospels? Would it contradict them? Would it be simple? Or would it reveal a Jesus we've never met before? A man, not a myth. A teacher, not a god. A voice, not a symbol. It's impossible to know, but the possibility lingers, and in the Vatican possibility is often treated like danger. Because the Church is not just a guardian of truth, it's a guardian of certainty, and certainty doesn't tolerate too many versions of the story. And yet faith doesn't live in certainty. It lives in mystery, in longing, in that quiet space where we say, I don't know, but I still believe. And maybe that's why these potential records remain sealed. Not to hide scandal, but to preserve mystery, to keep the questions alive, because questions lead to wonder, and wonder is its own kind of holiness. So if Jesus wrote something and it rests in a dark Vatican drawer, maybe it's waiting for the right eyes, or maybe it was never meant to be seen at all, just imagined, just hoped for, just enough to make you pause for a moment in the middle of the night and wonder, what else don't we know? And what if the man we've followed for 2,000 years still has something left to say? Let's step off the well-worn roads of Galilee for a moment, past the hills of Judea, past the shores of the sea, and into lands where the name Jesus wasn't known, at least not yet, because somewhere between the verses of Scripture and the centuries of silence, there's a question that refuses to stay buried. What if Jesus traveled east? It begins as many mysteries do with what's missing. The Gospels tell us about his birth, a few glimpses of boyhood, then nothing. Nearly 20 years disappear, what some call the lost years of Jesus. He vanishes from the page until he's 30 years old, standing waist-deep in the Jordan River, being baptized by John. So where was he? Tradition tells us he remained in Nazareth, a humble carpenter, quiet, waiting for the appointed time. But what if he didn't wait? What if he walked? Some scholars, travelers, and mystics believe that during those silent decades, Jesus journeyed to lands far beyond the Roman Empire, to Egypt, where desert hermits whispered prayers older than pyramids, to Persia, where Zoroastrian fire temples burned with ancient symbols of light, even to India, where sages meditated beneath Bodhi trees and taught liberation not through law, but through awakening. It sounds impossible, but let's look closer. In the foothills of the Himalayas, in a remote monastery in Ladakh, a curious story began to surface in the 19th century. A Russian traveler named Nicholas Notovich claimed to have discovered ancient scrolls written in Pali scrolls that spoke of a holy man from the west named Issa. According to the monks, Issa had come from a distant land to study the Vedas, to sit with Brahmins, and to question caste and cruelty. He was described as gentle, wise, given to parables, but when he challenged the religious leaders, he was cast out and he returned to his homeland to teach what he had learned. Does that sound familiar? Notovich published a book in 1894 titled The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. It caused an uproar. Critics accused him of fabricating the story. Scholars dismissed it as fantasy. And yet, the tale persisted. Years later, other researchers like Swami Abhedananda and Nicholas Roerich claim to have seen similar documents in Tibetan monasteries. Each account was slightly different, as oral histories tend to be, but the thread remained a young teacher from the West, with piercing insight and revolutionary ideas, who stayed for several years before returning home. Of course, the Vatican never officially acknowledged any of this, but neither have they condemned it in forceful terms. Just silence, a pause, not a rebuttal. There's also Egypt, not the Egypt of Exodus, but the Egypt of Alexandria, a city of libraries, scrolls, and syncretic thought. In Jesus' time, Alexandria was a melting pot of Hellenistic philosophy, Jewish mysticism, and Egyptian rites. It was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and more importantly, it had a large Jewish population. If a young Jewish man wanted to explore deeper dimensions of faith, Alexandria would have been a natural destination. It was just a short journey away, safe, familiar in language and custom, but richer in books, teachers, and ideas. Some early Christian thinkers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria wrote of secret traditions, deeper teachings passed on to only a few. Not heresy, they said, but wisdom for those ready to hear. Could Jesus have been among them? One theory suggests that Jesus studied the teachings of the Therapeutae, a Jewish monastic sect in Egypt that combined scriptural devotion with mysticism, healing, and ascetic living. They dwelled in silence, fasted, prayed. They saw illness not as punishment, but as imbalance, and healing as sacred work. Even the name Therapeutae hints at connection. It's where we get our modern word therapist, a healer, like the Jesus of the Gospels. There's no solid archaeological evidence for these travels, no ticket stubs, no travel logs. But the historical gap is real, and the cultural connections, however tenuous, linger like incense. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "I have other sheep that are not of this fold." Was he referring to future believers, or to distant lands? There's also the matter of language. Jesus likely spoke Aramaic, a dialect of Hebrew, but his teachings were later written in Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Roman world. Yet some of his sayings, particularly the more poetic or paradoxical ones, bear resemblance to Eastern aphorisms found in Buddhist or Vedantic traditions. Blessed are the meek. The first shall be last. Lose your life, and you will find it. These teachings are not exclusive to Christianity. Similar themes appear in the Dhammapada, in the Upanishads, in Taoist texts. That doesn't prove borrowing, but it suggests resonance, a spiritual alignment that crosses geography, a harmony of insight. So what would it mean if Jesus had studied in the East? Not that he was any less divine, but that his path to enlightenment was shaped not only by Judaism, but by a global spiritual ecosystem. That his wisdom came not from a vacuum, but from pilgrimage, listening, learning, walking across borders of culture and language. And maybe that's the real heresy, not the idea that Jesus learned from other traditions, but that such a truth would make him more human, not less divine. Because in a world divided by dogma, the image of Jesus seeking wisdom wherever it could be found is quietly revolutionary. But here's where the mystery deepens. If such documents ever existed, if scrolls describing Isa in India or records of his time in Egypt were ever real, where would they be today? Some say they were destroyed. Others say they're still hidden in monasteries. But a persistent theory claims they were brought to the Vatican, acquired by missionaries, monks, or archaeologists, and sealed in the archive, filed away. Not because they were false, but because they were too true. Too disruptive, too beautiful to burn, but too dangerous to share. That's the Vatican's paradox, a guardian of truth, and also its gatekeeper. So, as we imagine Jesus walking along the Ganges or standing beneath the stars of the Egyptian desert, ask yourself, does it make him less holy or more relatable? Does it threaten your faith or expand it? Because maybe the point isn't whether Jesus traveled to India or Egypt. Maybe the point is that he could have, and that the silence around those years is an invitation to explore, to wonder, to walk our own winding paths toward wisdom, just as he might have all those years ago. And if somewhere deep in the Vatican vaults there's a scroll that proves it, then maybe someday it'll see the light. Until then, we follow the footprints, even if they fade into the sand. Beneath the marble floors of Vatican City, beneath centuries of history and silence, there are vaults. We know this, but what we don't know, what lingers just on the edge of folklore and faith between science fiction and sacred conspiracy, is what might be humming in those vaults. Because according to one of the strangest and most persistent stories ever whispered about the Vatican, somewhere below the surface lies a device. It doesn't open doors, it opens time. They call it the chronovisor. The story begins in the 1950s with a Benedictine monk named Father Pellegrino Ernetti. Ernetti wasn't just a priest, he was also a physicist, a scholar of ancient music, a man who moved comfortably between the divine and the scientific. And sometime during that decade, according to his own account, he was invited to be part of a secret project, one that would change how we understand both history and destiny. The project, he claimed, was the creation of a machine that could see through time, not by traveling through it, but by observing it, like tuning into a cosmic recording still echoing through the fabric of the universe. Ernetti said the chronovisor could reconstruct scenes from the past by detecting residual electromagnetic waves left behind by all events, like how a sound echoes in a canyon or how a scent lingers after someone leaves a room, except this would be visual auditory total. He claimed the device could tune into these frequencies and project them like a hologram. What did he see? According to Ernetti, the chronovisor allowed him and a select group of scientists, some say 12 in total, to witness extraordinary moments. Among them, a performance of a lost play by Quintus Ennius, the Roman playwright, a speech by Cicero in the Roman Senate, and most controversially, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He described the scene in detail, the pain, the crowd, the expressions. He said he saw Jesus weep not from agony, but from love. Ernetti eventually published a description of what he saw in an Italian newspaper. Later, a photograph was released, a blurry image of a suffering Christ on the cross. Critics quickly pointed out that the photo resembled a well-known statue from a church in Umbria. And Ernetti, under pressure, recanted the photo's authenticity, but never his story. In fact, on his deathbed in 1994, he reportedly said the chronovisor was real, that the Vatican had dismantled it, that it was too powerful, too dangerous, and that it was now locked away for good. But why would the church hide such a thing? Think about it. If you could see history exactly as it happened, no interpretation, no redactions, what would it mean for theology, for faith, for power? If the crucifixion happened differently than described in the Gospels, what happens to doctrine? If Jesus said something that was never written down, or didn't say something that was what happens to belief? What if you could witness miracles and find they were metaphor? Or worse, what if you could confirm them undeniably, indisputably? What would that do to the idea of faith? Because faith by definition requires mystery. The chronovisor would strip that away. It would end arguments, rewrite history books. It could even be used as a weapon not to change the past, but to control the narrative of it. To pull up images from 1,000 years ago and say, "See, this is truth." That's a power no institution should have. And yet, the rumor persists. Books have been written. Investigators have tried to track down Ernetti's notes, his schematics. Some claim the plans were passed on to trusted hands hidden in monasteries. Others say the technology never existed, but that the idea was enough to make the church nervous. And what of the other 12? If the chronovisor was real, Ernetti didn't build it alone. The names have never been confirmed, but whispers say the team included physicists, engineers, and even members of the Vatican's own intelligence network. Some suggest Werner von Braun, the former Nazi scientist who helped launch the American space program, may have been involved. Others claim Enrico Fermi, father of the nuclear age, was consulted. It's all speculation, but even now, in quiet corners of the internet and fringe academic circles, people wonder, could it be true? Could time like light be caught, replayed? And if so, is it moral? The Vatican has never made a public statement on the chronovisor. No denial, no confirmation, just silence. And in the Vatican, silence can be louder than words. Critics dismiss the whole thing as pseudoscience. They point out the logistical impossibilities. They remind us that history doesn't leave behind literal wave recordings, that electromagnetic radiation decays, that there's no known physical mechanism by which time could be seen like a videotape, and yet history is full of impossibilities. Air travel, moon landings, communication with satellites from 23,000 miles away. Electricity, once called magic, now powers our lamps, and quantum physics. That's just science learning how to think like poetry. So maybe, just maybe, the chronovisor isn't a machine. Maybe it's a metaphor, a stand-in for the idea that someone somewhere knows more than they're telling us. And maybe the real secret isn't the device, but the memories. What if the Vatican has seen things? What if the archive contains not a machine, but documents, recorded visions from saints, seers, or remote viewers? Descriptions so detailed they read like transcripts of forgotten moments. What if someone did see the crucifixion and described it not in metaphor, but in minutes and seconds? Would you want to read that? Would it change what you believe? Or would it only add another layer to the mystery? The idea of the chronovisor captures our deepest longing to know, to see, to close the gap between history and certainty, between story and experience. But perhaps that gap is sacred. Perhaps the silence between facts is where meaning lives, because if every mystery were solved, what would we dream about? So for now, the chronovisor, real or imagined, remains locked away, behind Vatican walls, behind human doubt, waiting not to be built, but to be believed. The stars above Vatican City are the same ones you see tonight. Faint pinpricks in the silence, scattered lights across the sky. For centuries, they were symbols of heaven, divine presence, or fate. But in more recent decades, they've come to mean something else. Mystery, visitation, the unknown. And deep inside the Vatican, a place we often associate with stained glass and incense, there are documents, reports, and files that suggest the church has been quietly watching the skies for a long, long time. Let's begin not in a cathedral, but in an observatory. Many are surprised to learn that the Vatican runs one of the oldest astronomical institutions in the world. It's called the Vatican Observatory, and it dates back to the late 1500s. Today, its modern counterpart is located not in Rome, but atop Mount Graham in Arizona, in a state-of-the-art facility co-run with the University of Arizona. Yes, the Vatican has telescopes in the desert, and not just small ones. One of the instruments used by Vatican astronomers is named LUCIFER, an unfortunate acronym that stands for Large Binocular Telescope Near-Infrared Utility, with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research. Despite the eerie name, the research is deeply scientific: stars, galaxies, the birth of the universe. But it raises a question: why does the Church, a religious institution, invest so heavily in the study of space? Because space, after all, is full of questions, and perhaps none more unsettling than this: are we alone? Officially, the Church has a surprisingly open view on the matter. In 2008, the Vatican's chief astronomer, Father José Gabriel Funes, made headlines when he said that believing in the possibility of extraterrestrial life does not contradict Catholic theology. He even referred to potential alien beings as our brothers in creation. His reasoning: God is infinite. Creation is vast. Why would a divine creator limit life to just one planet? The statement shocked some, comforted others, and confused many more. But it wasn't an isolated thought. In fact, records suggest that the Vatican has been quietly investigating unusual aerial phenomena for decades. Let's go back to 1947, the year of the infamous Roswell incident. Just days after the reported crash, Vatican officials stationed in the US are said to have received confidential briefings. Some of those reports, according to leaked intelligence, were sent back to Rome encoded and placed under restricted review. Then there's Project Blue Book, the US Air Force's decades-long investigation into UFOs. Some of the scientists who worked on it later claimed that religious leaders, including Vatican representatives, were occasionally consulted, not for theological debate, but for insight on how humanity might react to confirmation of non-human intelligence. And then there's the Majestic 12 documents, those controversial, possibly forged, possibly authentic files that reference a secret global coalition managing extraterrestrial contact. Several versions list a Vatican liaison. Of course, these documents are heavily debated, but the lack of an official Vatican response speaks volumes. No angry denials, no press conferences, just silence. And in that silence, speculation grows. There are persistent rumors never confirmed, never denied, that somewhere beneath the Apostolic Palace exists a sealed chamber of anomalous records. Not just letters and scrolls, but items, artifacts, debris. One such story speaks of a metallic fragment recovered after an airship crash in 1933 near Milan, an incident predating Roswell by over a decade. The debris, it said, was quietly retrieved by Mussolini's Secret Service and later handed over to the Vatican for safekeeping. Why? Because the Church had the resources to store it and the incentive to keep it quiet. Another tale, even stranger, describes a manuscript allegedly found in the Vatican archive. Dated to the 15th century, it speaks of visitors from the sky whose chariots made no sound. The document describes lights that danced in the air and beings not of Adam's line who spoke with the tongues of fire. It could be myth, symbol, or something else. So what does the Church truly believe? It seems the Vatican is preparing for something. In 2010, a series of Vatican-sponsored conferences were held on the topic of astrobiology. The participants, not just theologians, but physicists, astronomers, and biologists from around the world. Their discussions focused not on whether alien life exists, but on how to respond if we find it. How would it affect faith? Would the doctrine of original sin apply to extraterrestrials? Would Jesus have saved only Earth? Or would God send a savior to every corner of the cosmos? The questions weren't answered. They were planted, and maybe that's the point. You see, the Vatican has always moved slowly, carefully, and often in advance. While nations race to weaponize space, while agencies debate disclosure, the Church is meditating on how such knowledge might affect the human soul. Not panic, not denial, but transformation. Because if contact comes, if tomorrow morning a craft lands in Central Park or hovers over the Tiber, people will turn to science for explanation. But many will turn to faith for meaning. And the Vatican wants to be ready. Some believe they already are. There's a theory, an eerie one, that the Church knows contact has already occurred. That somewhere hidden away are ancient testimonies not of angels, but of others. That certain descriptions of heavenly beings, wheels of fire, faces like lightning, voices like trumpets, were not metaphors, but misunderstood encounters. Even in the Bible there are strange clues. The book of Ezekiel describes a vision of wheels within wheels, accompanied by flashing lights and roaring winds. Many theologians interpret it as symbolic, but some modern theorists suggest it reads uncannily, like a craft descending. And in the book of Genesis, there's that peculiar phrase, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives." Who were these sons of God? It's vague, uncomfortable, forgotten, or perhaps intentionally ignored. If the Vatican has answers, they aren't sharing them yet. But maybe they're preparing the questions, because at the heart of the Church's silence is not fear, it's stewardship. If humanity ever finds itself looking into alien eyes, we won't just need scientists and politicians. We'll need meaning. We'll need a story big enough to hold the stars. And the Vatican quietly, patiently is writing one, not with fire and brimstone, but with a whisper, a telescope pointed toward the dark, a file in a vault, a thought that perhaps we are not alone, and perhaps we never were. When most people picture the Vatican, they imagine timeless rituals, blessings in Latin gilded altars, a pope waving from a balcony. But few picture something else: smoke-filled rooms, false documents, and silent deals struck behind ancient doors. Because beneath the image of spiritual purity lies a murkier history, one that doesn't just involve saints and scriptures, but spies, fugitives, and escape. This is the story of the rat lines, the secret escape routes used by high-ranking Nazi officials after World War II, and how some of those routes may have run straight through the heart of the Holy See. Let's begin in 1945. The war is over. Hitler is dead. The Third Reich is collapsing. And across Europe, Allied forces are rounding up Nazi officers, many of whom face arrest for war crimes, genocide, torture, slave labor. The Nuremberg trials loom. Justice is coming. But not everyone is caught. Some simply vanish. They don't disappear by accident. They're helped. And this is where the Vatican's shadow falls long. Dozens of historians, including former intelligence officers, now believe that members of the Catholic Church, not rogue individuals, but networks, were involved in facilitating the escape of hundreds, perhaps thousands of Nazis. They forged documents, created aliases, provided safe houses, and more than once they used the cover of religious charity to smuggle fugitives across borders. How did it work? It begins with Red Cross travel papers. After the war, millions of refugees flooded Europe. Displaced persons, civilians, survivors, prisoners of war, all needed help. The Red Cross and other humanitarian agencies issued temporary passports called International Committee of the Red Cross travel documents. All it took was a sympathetic priest and a new name. In Rome, a few steps away from the Vatican walls, there were safe houses where ex-Nazis were sheltered. In some cases, priests provided food and shelter. In others, they handed over real travel papers, sometimes blessed with the Vatican's silent approval. Many of the escapees fled to South America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Others went to Syria or Egypt. They were aided not by coincidence, but by design. And some of them were among the worst offenders. Take Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust. He vanished after the war, slipping into Argentina under the name Ricardo Clement. How did he get there? With fake documents, some of which traced back to the Vatican-linked networks in Rome. Or Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, responsible for countless murders and tortures in occupied France. He escaped to Bolivia. His travel route, Italy. Again, through channels connected to clerical assistance. One name often appears in these accounts: Bishop Alois Hudal. Hudal was an Austrian clergyman stationed in Rome. He was the rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima, the German seminary located within the Vatican's reach. Publicly, he preached forgiveness. Privately, he wrote that helping Nazi officers was part of a higher duty, protecting fellow Christians from what he called the vengeance of the Allies. He believed he was saving souls. Others believe he was protecting war criminals. Hudal helped many escape. He admitted it. And yet, he was never punished. Why? Some say he acted alone. Others say he had quiet approval. The truth may never be fully known. The Vatican has never opened its World War II archives entirely, though in 2020 it made a significant gesture by unsealing the records from the papacy of Pope Pius X, who led the Church during the war. That papacy is controversial in itself. Pius XIV has long been criticized for not doing enough to speak out against Hitler. His defenders argue he worked behind the scenes to save Jewish lives. Critics say his silence enabled genocide. What's clear is this: during and after the war, the Vatican walked a careful, often ambiguous line. They saw the Soviet Union as the greatest threat. Communism, not Nazism, was the enemy of faith. So when the war ended, the church shifted quickly. Nazi crimes were condemned, but some church officials seemed more concerned with preventing the spread of Marxism. That priority reshaped alliances. And in the confusion, moral clarity blurred. This isn't to say the Vatican helped all Nazis. Many priests risked their lives to resist fascism. Some were imprisoned, tortured, killed. But at the higher levels, something else happened. Something colder. A choice. A calculation. And perhaps a deal. Some theories suggest that certain Nazis offered information in exchange for protection lists, technologies, intelligence about the Soviets. These rumors mirror the post-war deals struck by US and Soviet agencies like Operation Paperclip, where former Nazi scientists were quietly brought to America to help launch the space race. Could the Vatican have made its own arrangements? It's possible, and perhaps probable. There are even rumors, never proven, never denied, that gold art or documents stolen during the war were funneled through ecclesiastical channels. Some suspect hidden vaults. Others point to the Vatican Bank, already infamous for its opaque financial practices. In 1997, a lawsuit was filed in California against the Vatican Bank, accusing it of laundering Nazi loot. The case was eventually dismissed for lack of jurisdiction, but it reignited questions. What else is buried beneath the surface? Today, the Vatican maintains that it did not knowingly assist war criminals, that individual priests may have acted on their own, that the Church as an institution had no policy of aiding escape. But history doesn't always need confession to leave a trail. The flight routes are documented, the forged papers have been found, the names are recorded, and in the quiet corners of the Vatican Library, there may still be letters, faded, typed, marked confidential, that connect the dots. Because if there's one thing the Vatican understands better than anyone, it's that the past never really disappears. It just waits to be found. So when you hear the word Vatican, don't just picture incense and hymns. Picture corridors at night, doors that open with no names on them, a man with a collar and a passport stamped with someone else's name, a prayer whispered not for redemption, but for escape, and somewhere deep in the archives, a folder that still hasn't been read, or maybe one that has. It's easy to forget lying here in the quiet dark that the Bible as we know it was edited, not just translated, not merely interpreted, but chosen, selected, piece by piece across centuries by councils and kings, by bishops and bureaucrats. Entire books, chapters, and voices were voted on, added, removed, or quietly ignored. It's not a single scroll from heaven passed down untouched. It's a library, a curated collection, and for every word we now read aloud in churches and whisper before sleep, there are others. Others that didn't make the cut. Some were too strange, others too political. Some contradicted the official teachings. Some portrayed Jesus too human. Some not human enough. And the decisions, what stayed and what vanished, were not always made with divine clarity. Tonight we open that door, just slightly, just enough to let a few of those lost voices speak. Let's begin with the Gospel of Thomas. Discovered in 1945 in the sands of Nag Hammadi, Egypt, this gospel is a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. There's no narrative, no miracles, no crucifixion or resurrection, just words. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift a stone, and you will find me. It's mystical, spare, strangely modern. Some scholars believe it may be as old or older than the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. But it didn't survive the early church councils. Why? Perhaps because it emphasized direct personal knowledge of the divine, what some would later call Gnosticism. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't ask for belief in dogma. It doesn't even insist on Jesus as a savior. Instead, it whispers something quieter, that the kingdom of God is already within you, waiting, buried beneath the noise. That was dangerous. Then there's the Gospel of Mary, yes, that Mary. Long buried by dust and doctrine, this fragmented manuscript presents Mary Magdalene not as a weeping sinner at the foot of the cross, but as a leader, a teacher, the one who truly understood Jesus' message. In the text, she comforts the disciples. She shares visions. And when Peter challenges her authority, she replies not with meekness, but confidence. Do you think I imagined all this by myself? Her gospel ends abruptly, torn, missing pages. Some say those pages were never found. Others believe they were never meant to be found. What would it mean if the church's most cherished male apostles had been led spiritually and intellectually by a woman? And what if that woman had once been erased not by history, but by choice? There's more. The Gospel of Judas, discovered in the 1970s, portrays Judas Iscariot not as a traitor, but as Jesus' most trusted disciple. According to this version, Jesus asks Judas to betray him not out of malice, but to fulfill a divine plan. It's a story of sacrifice, not sabotage. In this telling, Judas becomes not the villain, but the only one who truly understood what needed to be done. Imagine how that would rewrite centuries of theology, of sermons, of stained glass windows. And imagine what it says about how easy it is to misunderstand a story. Of course, not all excluded texts are ancient gospels. Some are histories, letters, prophecies. The Book of Enoch, once revered in early Jewish and Christian communities, describes fallen angels, celestial battles, and journeys through heaven and hell. It paints a cosmic war and hints at secret knowledge taught to humans by beings not of earth. Today, it's considered apocryphal. But in Ethiopia, the Book of Enoch is still part of the biblical canon. Why is it scripture in one tradition, but heresy in another? Because authority defines truth. And that's what makes the Vatican archives so unsettling. Because inside those shelves sealed behind layers of permission language and tradition are not just theological debates. There may be lost gospels, or more accurately, gospels that were never truly lost, just hidden. Some say the Vatican holds multiple versions of familiar books, drafts that don't match the final versions, edits, lines that were once there and then removed. Perhaps the original Gospel of Mark, which ends not with the resurrection, but with silence. Others believe there are entirely unknown texts, letters from early bishops, teachings of first-century Christian sects, writings from women, from mystics, from those whose vision of the divine was more inclusive or more dangerous. There are also persistent rumors of a fifth gospel not written by a disciple, but by a Roman, a centurion, the man who stood at the foot of the cross and whispered, "Surely this was the Son of God." His journal, if it exists, would be a rare first-hand account, political, pragmatic, but honest, brutally honest. But if it contradicts the official narrative, then it would remain unread. There's a reason these texts were excluded. Some were simply inconsistent, some bordered on fantasy, but others were too independent. They offered direct access to the divine without need for priests or temples. They blurred the lines between God and humanity, between church and seeker. And that kind of freedom was frightening. It still is. Today, the Vatican allows access to some ancient manuscripts. Scholars can request specific documents, but only by title. You cannot simply ask, "Show me all the banned Gospels." You must know what you're looking for. And even then, the answer might be no. Some files remain restricted, for preservation, they say, but perhaps also for control. Because if the public discovered that early Christianity was more diverse, more debated, and more mystical than previously taught, what would happen? Would faith fracture, or would it deepen? Would we fear the uncertainty, or finally embrace it? Maybe that's the real gospel, not a single book, but a chorus, a harmony of voices, Some high, some low. Some we've heard all our lives. Others just beginning to hum through the silence. The Vatican may never release them all, but somewhere in those long, dim halls, a scroll waits. And maybe in the dark stillness of this night, so do you, listening. Not for certainty, but for the whisper of a story that was never truly lost, just waiting to be read again. In the quiet hills of Portugal, just after the Great War, 3 shepherd children knelt in the dust. It was 1917. The world had been torn apart by machines and empires. Nations were mourning sons. And in the countryside near the town of Fatima, something strange began to stir. Lucia, Francisco, Jacinta, just children, no education, no doctrine, just sheep and sky. But they claimed that between May and October of that year, they saw a lady radiant, clothed in light. She appeared 6 times. Each time she gave them a message, and one of those messages was to be kept secret. This is the story of the 3 secrets of Fatima, and how the Vatican has spent over a century trying to manage them. The first 2 secrets revealed in 1941 are deeply symbolic. The children through Lucia's writings described visions of hell, of tortured souls and burning seas. The Virgin warned that unless humanity turned to prayer, greater horrors would come. War, suffering, the rise of atheistic regimes. The second secret even predicted the rise of Soviet Russia and requested the consecration of the country to Mary's Immaculate Heart. Many believers saw this as miraculous, but it was the third secret that sparked the storm. For decades it remained locked away. Not even popes spoke of it in detail. Rumors swirled that it foretold the end of the world, the death of a pope, or even an apocalyptic war that would consume all of mankind. Some said it spoke of a crisis in the church itself, a betrayal from within. In 2000, under pressure, the Vatican finally released what it claimed was the full third secret. In it, Lucia described a bishop in white, walking through a ruined city, stepping over corpses. He ascends a hill and is killed by soldiers. Behind him, other clergy fall. The Vatican interpreted this as a vision of the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. He had been shot in St. Peter's Square and miraculously survived. He himself believed that Mary's hand had guided the bullet away from his heart. The prophecy, they said, had been fulfilled. But not everyone agreed. For many, the bishop in white seemed to represent not just John Paul II, but the very soul of the church. And the ruin, the bodies, the soldiers, none of that matched what happened in Rome in 1981. Moreover, there were whispers from clergy, some of whom had read the original secret in the 1960s, that the version released in 2000 wasn't complete. That part of the text was missing. That Mary had warned of a coming apostasy, a loss of faith not from outside enemies, but from within the walls of the Vatican itself. One Italian cardinal was famously quoted as saying, "It is enough to cause fainting to lose one's breath." Another reportedly wept upon reading it. What could be so terrible? Theories abound. Some say it predicts a future schism, a split in the church, where doctrine is torn apart by modern ideologies. Others believe it foretells the fall of Rome, either metaphorical or literal, that the Vatican itself will be compromised. Still others say the secret warns of a false pope, a man dressed in holy robes, speaking gentle words, but working against the faith from the inside. Of course, none of this is confirmed. The Vatican has repeatedly insisted that the full secret is now public, that the matter is closed. But even Pope Benedict XVI, in a moment of rare ambiguity, once said, "We would be mistaken to think that the prophetic mission of Fatima is complete." And there's more. Lucia, the surviving visionary, became a nun. She lived in a Carmelite convent until her death in 2005. Over the years, she wrote letters, some of which remain unpublished. Some insiders claim she left behind instructions. Others whisper of additional writings never shown to the public. Why the secrecy? Perhaps it's fear. A prophecy once spoken aloud becomes real, interpreted, politicized, and the Church, careful as ever, may have chosen containment over clarity. But perhaps it's something else. Perhaps the third secret doesn't predict one single event. Perhaps it is a warning about a pattern, a cycle. Throughout history, religious institutions have faced moments of reckoning, corruption, division, decline, and always they have either purified or collapsed. What if the third secret simply reminds us that no kingdom, no matter how holy, is immune from time, that no temple stands forever, and that faith, if not renewed, becomes fossil? In 2017, on the 100th anniversary of the apparitions, Pope Francis visited Fatima. He prayed at the site, spoke words of peace, but he did not mention the third secret. Instead, he offered something simpler: silence, not denial, but reverence, because maybe that's what prophecy is meant to do, not predict, but provoke, to shake us, to ask, are we listening? Are we paying attention? And maybe the real message of Fatima isn't hidden in a vault or buried in a letter. Maybe it's what the children said from the beginning: pray, return, change. So whether the third secret is complete or not, its mystery remains, and the Vatican, with all its cathedrals and codes, still guards it, in ink, in memory, in silence. Somewhere in the quiet corridors of the archive, a faded envelope lies untouched, not because it's forgotten, but because sometimes mystery itself is the message. Most of us are familiar with the stories of Jesus' birth: a manger in Bethlehem, a star overhead, shepherds, angels, the three wise men bearing gifts, and then silence. The next time the Bible shows us Jesus, he's 12 years old teaching at the temple. After that, another long gap until he turns 30 and begins his ministry. A span of nearly 2 decades. Missing. What happened during those years? Where did he go? What did he learn? Who shaped him into the man who would change the world? The canonical Gospels say almost nothing, but there are other stories, and some of them are still locked away. Welcome to the mystery of the infancy Gospels, ancient texts that claim to fill in the blanks of Jesus' youth. Some were dismissed as heretical, others were lost. But whispers persist that among the Vatican's most tightly held manuscripts is a version of Christ's childhood unlike anything most have ever heard. Let's begin with what's known. There are several early Christian texts that attempt to describe Jesus as a child. The most famous is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas we explored earlier. In it, young Jesus is not the soft golden-haired figure of modern nativity plays. He's powerful, temperamental, unpredictable. At 5 years old, he molds birds out of clay and then commands them to fly. When another child bumps into him, Jesus is said to strike the boy down. When a teacher scolds him, Jesus blinds him. Later, he brings the same boy back to life. The stories feel foreign, jarring more like tales of a demigod than the gentle Messiah. Many early church fathers rejected these accounts. They feared what such stories might do to people's image of Christ. A child with absolute power, unrestrained by maturity, is a troubling figure. Not the meek and mild Jesus so central to the church's teachings. And yet, these stories circulated, copied by hand, read aloud in villages, preserved in the corners of Christian thought, even if never officially embraced. Then there's the Gospel of the Infancy, also called the Arabic Infancy Gospel, which describes Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt with Jesus. There he is said to perform miracles, heal the sick, even exorcise demons, all as a young boy. In one tale, he is approached by 2 possessed children foaming at the mouth. Jesus touches them, and they fall still. In another, he speaks with wisdom that baffles every adult in the room. These aren't just stories, they're attempts to explain, to make sense of the silent years, to fill the void between crib and cross. So what does the Vatican know? Officially, the Church does not consider these infancy Gospels part of the biblical canon. They are apocryphal, interesting, but not authoritative. And yet, in the depths of the Vatican Library, There are said to be versions of these texts that differ from the fragments available to scholars today. Longer, older, more complete. Some theologians who have studied Vatican archives describe manuscripts that contain early teachings of Jesus lessons delivered to other children, not parables for the masses. Words that focus not on sin, but on identity, on understanding the divine spark within. One rumored passage begins, "Before you knew your name, I called you by light." It is poetic, intimate, almost mystical. There are even suggestions that among these writings are descriptions of Jesus traveling with his family, not just to Egypt, but possibly beyond. Some fringe theories propose that Jesus spent time in India or Persia or among ascetic communities in the deserts of the Middle East, that he studied ancient wisdom traditions, that his teachings were influenced not just by Judaism, but by something wider. The Vatican has never acknowledged such texts exist, but again, they have not denied it either. Some believe that these stories were suppressed not because they're false, but because they challenge the neat, controlled image of Jesus presented by the Gospels, a Jesus who explores, questions, studies, grows, a Jesus who becomes the Christ rather than arriving fully formed. For centuries, the Church has emphasized Jesus' divinity, God, from birth, flawless from the first breath. But the idea of a child who learns, struggles, even stumbles, that's a Jesus who is relatable, but also vulnerable. And that vulnerability makes some nervous. Because if Jesus changed, evolved, searched, then maybe faith must too. There's another reason these texts may have been buried. Some of the infancy Gospels hint that Mary herself had visions, that she was not just the mother of Jesus, but a spiritual teacher in her own right. One passage describes her describing a dream of stars falling from the sky and forming a circle around her child. Symbolic, yes, but also suggestive of a deeper mystical understanding. One Vatican archivist who spoke anonymously once claimed that entire volumes of Marian writings exist. Meditations, reflections, prayers. They were never canonized, but they were kept. Why? Perhaps because the image of Mary as simply the mother was easier to manage than that of a mystic. Perhaps because the childhood of Jesus, full of wonder, of wild power, and growing self-awareness, was too unpredictable to fit into the liturgy. And yet, those years matter, because they are our years, the years of uncertainty, of becoming, of waking up to the world and asking, who am I? Maybe that's why these texts still draw curiosity, not to rewrite theology, but to remind us that even in the holiest of lives, there was mystery. So tonight, as the world outside grows still, imagine this: a child half lit by oil lamp drawing shapes in sand, a voice too young to preach whispering truths not yet fully understood, a mother watching not with fear, but with wonder, and somewhere deep beneath Vatican marble that child's forgotten words, still waiting to be heard. Maps are strange things. At first glance they seem simple lines, rivers, mountains' names. But every map is a story, a decision about what to include, what to leave out, a declaration of power, of memory, of belief. And deep within the Vatican, beneath centuries of marble, past the public galleries and gilded chapels, there are maps you've never seen, maps that shouldn't exist, maps of places we were never taught. Welcome to the Vatican's secret map room, a chamber that, according to insiders and whispers from scholars, holds forbidden geography, and with it, questions that could rewrite our understanding of human history. Let's begin with what we know for certain. The gallery of maps in the Vatican museums is a public treasure. Lining the long hall are frescoes commissioned in the 1580s by Pope Gregory XIII. They depict Italy in exquisite detail, region by region, in the best cartographic knowledge of the time. But that's just the surface, because behind the locked doors of the Vatican archives lie older maps, stranger ones, maps that challenge not just geography, but chronology. One of the most infamous examples, though not confirmed to be in Vatican hands, is the Piri race map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. It shows part of South America and something else. A detailed depiction of Antarctica, unfrozen, centuries before the continent was officially discovered and long before radar could detect the landmass beneath the ice. The coastline is accurate, eerily so. Scientists and cartographers have long puzzled over it. Where did the information come from? Ancient sources, lost civilizations. Some theorists believe the Vatican possesses similar maps, fragments from ancient sailors, Phoenicians, or even civilizations. Far older, long erased by time. These maps, it's said, show coastlines that no longer exist, islands swallowed by the sea, and continents whose names have never been spoken aloud in our lifetime. One persistent rumor involves a map of the world from the 4th century, written in Greek, and preserved in the Vatican's Greek-Latin collection. This map, if real, doesn't just show Europe, Asia, and Northern Africa, but also land masses across the Atlantic. Not distorted speculation, full coastlines, inlets, mountains. One of them, according to fragments translated in the early 20th century, bears an inscription, Terra Incognita Dei, the unknown land of God. Could it be a poetic name for the Americas? Or something else entirely? Some researchers believe this map also includes a submerged landform in the Indian Ocean, detailed with annotations in Latin that describe temples of stone visible from the waves. These writings predate the modern concept of plate tectonics. It's as if someone recorded land that later vanished. Skeptics argue it's fanciful, but those who've gained partial access to the Vatican's cartographic holdings insist there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of unpublished maps, and not all are terrestrial. One particularly enigmatic item mentioned briefly in the private notes of a Jesuit scholar is an astronomical star chart not of Earth's sky, but of a system entirely unfamiliar. The stars are marked not with names, but with symbols. Geometric, repetitive, like a language. There is no date on the document. But in the margin, someone has scrawled a question in Latin. Is this how the Magi found their way? Let's return to Earth. The Church, for most of its history, was the keeper of navigation. Jesuit explorers, Franciscan monks, and papal emissaries traveled the globe charting the unknown, not only for kings, but for the kingdom of heaven. They brought back scrolls from China, calendars from the Maya, sea charts from Arab traders. Some of what they collected made its way into European universities. But the rarest pieces, the oldest, the most anomalous, they were sent to Rome, to be studied, and sometimes sealed. There's one tale whispered by archivists of a 15th century scroll from Ethiopia illustrated with red ochre ink. It shows a landmass west of Africa and south of the equator. At its center, a tower rising high reaching the stars. Around it, symbols of the zodiac, the elements, and a ring of fire. At the bottom, a line in Ge'ez script, "This is the land that sank." Could it refer to Atlantis, Lemuria, or some forgotten kingdom now lost beneath sea and time? We don't know, because the Vatican has never commented. Not on that scroll, not on any of it. And that silence only fuels the speculation. What if the Church has preserved the memory of lands that predate the Bible? What if early travelers saw things we no longer see? What if the maps hidden in Rome's stone heart show us not just the past, but a path we've lost? It's worth remembering that maps don't just describe where we are. They tell us what we believe. In the Middle Ages, maps placed Jerusalem at the center, Eden at the top. The edges were marked with monsters. Here be dragons. It was faith drawn in ink. And now, perhaps faith has changed. But somewhere under locked and unlit corridors, those maps remain. With all their symbols, all their secrets, all their questions. A coastline that shouldn't exist. An island no longer found. A line connecting stars that don't belong in our sky. You might never see these documents. You may never hold their parchment or smell their centuries-old ink. But maybe you don't need to. Maybe it's enough to know they're there, waiting, not for discovery, but for permission, because the world, it seems, has always been bigger than we're told. And the Vatican quietly, carefully has always known. It looks like a faded photograph, the kind left too long in the sun. A long strip of linen cloth just over 14 feet long and a little more than 3 feet wide, woven in herringbone pattern, pale, almost ghost-like. And in the center of that cloth, an image, a face, a body, front and back, as if someone once lay there wrapped in silence and left a memory behind. This is the Shroud of Turin, and though it's kept in a cathedral in northern Italy, its true keeper, many believe, is the Vatican. Let's unfold its mystery. The shroud first entered historical record in the 14th century in France, in the hands of a noble family. It was said to be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, the same one wrapped around him after the crucifixion, the same one found empty when the tomb was opened. The image on the shroud shows a man who has suffered greatly, wounds in his wrists and feet, a gash in his side, blood marks around the forehead, as if from a crown of thorns. It's haunting, and yet it isn't painted. For centuries, scientists, skeptics, and theologians have debated, what is the Shroud of Turin? Is it a miracle, a medieval hoax, or something else entirely? Let's start with the science. In 1988, the Vatican authorized carbon dating on a small piece of the shroud. The results were disappointing to believers. It dated the cloth to the 13th or 14th century, suggesting it was a medieval forgery. Case closed. Not quite. The problem, as critics pointed out, was the sample site. The piece tested came from a corner that had been repaired, possibly centuries after the original cloth was made. Later, forensic analyses found that the weave and chemical composition of the tested sample didn't match the rest of the linen. In other words, they dated the patch, not the shroud. Since then, researchers have used everything from ultraviolet imaging to pollen analysis to try and understand the cloth's origins. They've found traces of plants that grow only in the Middle East, dusts and spores consistent with a burial environment, and perhaps most intriguingly, a three-dimensional quality to the image, unlike any painting or drawing. No brush strokes, no pigment. Some believe the image was created by a burst of radiant energy, a flash that scorched the cloth at a molecular level without burning through. Others say it's the result of centuries of contact and aging. And some, they say it's not of this world. A few physicists have even proposed that the image might have been formed by an unknown mechanism, something we don't yet understand, something that sits between matter and light, time and transformation. But what about the Church? The Vatican walks a careful line. It does not claim the shroud is definitively the burial cloth of Jesus, but it has called it an icon worthy of veneration. It has allowed scientific study and also prayer. Pope John Paul II referred to it as a mirror of the gospel. Pope Benedict XVI called it an image that speaks of silence. The shroud is now housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, behind bulletproof glass, controlled for temperature and humidity. It is shown to the public rarely, but its true home, its spiritual keeper, is Rome. The Vatican has studied the shroud for decades through commissioned scientists and internal debate. Some of the documents relating to those studies remain classified. Notes by bishops, theological arguments, photographs not released to the public. Why the secrecy? Perhaps because certainty is dangerous. If the shroud were declared authentic, it would be the most sacred relic in all of Christianity, proof of Jesus' suffering and perhaps even his resurrection. It would change everything. But if it were declared a hoax, it could shake millions. So the Vatican chooses neither. Instead, it protects the cloth and the mystery, because perhaps mystery is more powerful than proof. There's also a deeper theory whispered among those who study church history. It suggests that the shroud is not just a relic, but a key. In this view, the shroud is one of several hidden relics said to be linked to the final days of Jesus' life, artifacts scattered across the Holy Land preserved in secret, known only to the Church. These might include the veil of Veronica, said to hold the image of Christ's face; the sudarium of Oviedo, a blood-stained cloth believed to have covered Jesus' head; The holy lance, the spear said to pierce his side, and in some traditions, especially older esoteric ones, these items form a kind of sacred constellation. Not in the stars, but in the world. A map of energy, a symbol of divine presence woven into the very fabric of the earth. To declare the shroud real might mean awakening that constellation, or it might mean admitting the church has held something world-altering for centuries and kept it hidden. Let's return to the image itself. It is faint. You have to look closely. The eyes are closed. The mouth is peaceful. The hands rest over the body. It is not a portrait of suffering. It is a moment between death and something else. A pause. A breath not yet drawn again. And in that pause, a kind of beauty. Whatever your belief, the shroud carries with it something undeniable. A presence. You don't need to understand it. You only need to see it. And tonight, in the hush of your room, you can imagine it, laid out under candlelight, tended to by hands long gone, folded carefully, carried across mountains, hidden from soldiers, whispered about in monasteries, studied by popes who wept quietly in private chambers, not for the cloth, but for the one it once held. And even now, locked in its climate-controlled glass case, it waits, not for explanation, not for faith, but for your gaze, because some things are not meant to be solved, only witnessed. The word itself is enough to make the room feel colder. Exorcism. You've seen it in movies, priests holding crucifixes, children with hollow eyes, chants in Latin echoing through candlelit halls. But the real thing, it's quieter, slower, more uncertain. And the Vatican, it takes it very seriously. Most people don't realize this, but exorcism is still a formal rite, a ritual preserved by the Church for centuries, not folklore, not a relic of the past. It's written into canon law. There's a handbook, a training process, a line of authority, and at its center is a belief that evil, true personal evil, can take hold, not just of a place, but of a person. Let's start with what the Church teaches. According to the Vatican, demonic possession is rare. Most cases of supposed possession, they say, are actually psychological illness, trauma, or misunderstanding. But when all else fails, when medical and psychiatric help does nothing, there's a protocol. A bishop must authorize the rite, a trained exorcist must lead it, and it must be done with discretion, always. The Ritual Romanum, first issued in 1614 and updated in 1999, outlines the steps of the rite. It includes prayers, symbols, and phrases in Latin words meant to confront the spirit and compel it to leave. But it also includes cautions, because the Church knows how dangerous this work can be, not just physically, but spiritually. There's a reason most exorcists live quietly, anonymously. They don't speak publicly. They don't write books. They don't boast. Because what they deal with is often hard to explain. Take Father Gabriele Amorth, perhaps the most well-known Vatican exorcist of modern times. He served as the chief exorcist of Rome for decades until his death in 2016. By his own count, he performed tens of thousands of exorcisms, though he admitted that most were not full demonic possessions, but cases of influence oppression or infestation. Still, he spoke of moments that chilled even him. People speaking languages they'd never studied, objects flying across rooms, inhuman voices, unnatural strength, and most disturbing, a hatred so profound, so cold, that it could not be faked. Amorth claimed that Satan had entered the Vatican not as a horned figure, but as a quiet corruption, an erosion of faith, division, pride. He believed that evil often wears a cassock, and he wasn't alone. Within the Church, there's long been debate over how much power to give the exorcism rite. In some centuries, it was used frequently. In others, it was nearly abandoned, but always it remained. Why? Because evil is not theoretical, not to them. The Vatican trains exorcists at a secretive school in Rome, run by the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum. It offers courses on possession, discernment, spiritual authority. Attendance is by invitation only. Priests from around the world come to learn, and what they're taught isn't just ritual. They're taught how to recognize deception, how to spot false cases, how to protect themselves spiritually, emotionally, physically. Because sometimes the battle isn't with the demon, it's with doubt. Many exorcists speak of moments when they weren't sure if what they saw was real, when prayers felt useless, when they felt watched, hunted. One priest said, "The devil is clever. He doesn't show his face. He whispers in yours." Even the popes have spoken on it. Pope John Paul II reportedly performed an impromptu exorcism in 1982. Pope Benedict XVI supported increased training of exorcists during his papacy, and Pope Francis has publicly warned against dismissing the devil as mere symbolism. He once said he is not a myth, he is real, and he wants our destruction. That's strong language, but within the Vatican, some believe the threat goes beyond individual cases. There are whispers of a global increase in spiritual disturbances, more exorcism requests, more unexplained cases. Some priests report that traditional prayers no longer work the way they once did. One even described facing something he called the Ancient One, not a demon, but something older, a presence. He refused to say more. Is it real, or a projection of fear? Hard to say. But then, there are stories. A priest in South America who confronted a possessed boy, only for the boy to reveal secrets about the priest's childhood no one else knew. A nun in Italy who suffered stigmata and spoke in Aramaic despite having never learned it. A teenager in the Philippines whose voice dropped by 2 octaves when the exorcist entered the room and never returned to normal. These cases are rare, but they leave marks, and in the Vatican's archives there are dozens of folders labeled not with names, but with numbers. Exorcism reports, some going back centuries, some locked with restricted access. Only bishops, certain scholars, or the Pope himself can read them. Why so secret? Because power draws attention, and if the Church were to confirm that demonic forces had physically manifested, had moved, spoken, harmed, it would cause panic. Or worse, obsession. The Church does not want to turn exorcism into theater. It is not for the curious. It is for the desperate. There's also a long-standing rumor that the Vatican possesses ancient exorcism texts not included in modern rites. Prayers written in Greek, Coptic, and even Hebrew. Some say they are too dangerous to use, that they call on names not meant to be spoken aloud. One 12th century manual, known only by its catalog number, contains a warning. This rite binds not only the demon, but the one who speaks it, which raises the question, what happens when the exorcist is not strong enough? What happens when faith falters? And perhaps more importantly, what if the real battle isn't between priest and demon, but between belief and fear? Because in many ways exorcism is a test, not of the devil, but of the soul. To confront darkness is to risk being changed by it. To speak light into shadow is to risk being heard. So tonight, as you drift between worlds, remember this. Somewhere in a small chapel under flickering candles, a priest kneels. He whispers in Latin. He holds a relic. He's not sure what's inside the person before him, but he knows what's at stake. And in the Vatican, behind a sealed door, a document records what happened. Not for fame, not for fear, but for truth. In the soft hush of night, as candlelight flickers across ancient stone, imagine this. A device, not large, not loud. A smooth panel of brass and silver knobs set like old radio dials, and a screen faintly glowing. Not with images of the present, but of the past. Not a recording, a window. A glimpse into what has already happened. Moments gone, scenes faded, voices swallowed by time, now visible again. This is the mystery of the chronovisor. And if rumors are to be believed, the Vatican not only knows about it, they once used it. Let's begin with the man behind the legend, Father Pellegrino Ernetti. He was a Benedictine monk, a scholar of music, and a physicist. In the 1960s, he claimed to have been part of a secret project, one that, with the help of 12 scientists, produced a machine that could see into the past. They called it the chronovisor. According to Ernetti, it worked by detecting the residual energy of events, every sound, every word, every motion that has ever happened, still reverberating through space like echoes. The machine could tune into those echoes. The past, he said, had not disappeared. It had simply gone quiet, and the chronovisor could listen. Ernetti claimed the Vatican was involved, that certain church officials had access to the device, that it was used not just for curiosity, but to witness moments of religious significance. He said he saw Christ's crucifixion. He said he saw a performance of a lost play by the Roman philosopher Seneca. And then one day, the machine was dismantled. On purpose. Why? Ernetti said the Vatican feared what it could do, not just in terms of theology, but politics, privacy control. Because if the chronovisor was real, then no secret would ever stay buried. No lie could ever be told again without fear of being exposed. History would no longer be written, it would be witnessed. That kind of power is terrifying and incredibly dangerous. The Vatican, for its part, has denied the existence of the chronovisor. In 1988, it issued a statement declaring the machine was fictional. But they've made other declarations before, and sometimes silence can speak just as loudly as a denial. The details of Ernetti's story are tantalizing. He described the device in great detail: antennae made of mysterious alloys, a screen that could display both images and sound, and controls that allowed you to dial in specific dates and locations. He even produced a photograph, blurry sepia-toned, claiming it showed Jesus on the cross. Critics called it a fake. Some said it was a retouched version of a 19th century statue. But to others, the idea that the Vatican possesses technology capable of observing time was simply too intriguing to dismiss. Because even if Ernetti was exaggerating, what if he wasn't wrong? What if there was a project? What if the Vatican has been quietly funding research into non-linear time? After all, the Church has always had one foot in science: the Gregorian calendar, astronomy, genetics. The Vatican has an observatory, a scientific academy, a telescope in Arizona. They are not strangers to the frontiers of knowledge, and when it comes to time, there are ancient hints. Some apocryphal texts speak of seers who saw events before they happened, saints who described moments centuries before their birth. Even the Book of Revelation is in a way a vision of time outside time. Is it symbolic, or is it a clue? Could the chronovisor, if it exists, be based on principles we don't yet understand? Quantum echoes, residual information in the fabric of space-time. Physicists have speculated for decades that time may not be as linear as we perceive it. That memory, consciousness, and even light itself may move in ways we cannot yet detect. What if the Vatican has already detected it? There's more. A leaked memo attributed to Vatican insiders in the 1980s mentioned dangerous theoretical devices and a need to protect the sanctity of divine chronology. No direct mention of the chronovisor, but a veiled suggestion that something had been suppressed. And then there are the rules. In 1982, the Vatican issued a strange decree. It warned against the use of any instrument for recording the past if such should ever exist. It was oddly specific. Why warn against a machine no one believes is real? Unless it was real enough to worry about. Some believe the device still exists, locked deep within the Vatican's most restricted archives, protected not just by walls, but by doctrine, waiting for the right moment. Or perhaps never to be used again. And maybe that's for the best. Because if we could look back, truly, look how long before we would be tempted to change what we saw, to erase, to control, to rewrite. The chronovisor may not be just a machine. It may be a mirror, and what we see there might be more than we're ready for. But tonight, in the quiet dark, imagine it just once. You walk into a dim chamber, the scent of incense in the air, a row of switches, a flicker of static. You turn the dial to a date long gone. A hum begins. And suddenly the past is not a memory. It's there, before you, living, breathing, and now, never secret again. Whether it was ever built or only imagined, the chronovisor asks us a haunting question. If you could see the truth, would you? And if you did, could you ever close your eyes again? The year was 1947. A shepherd boy chasing a stray goat through the cliffs near the Dead Sea tossed a rock into a cave and heard the sound of something breaking. Not bone, not stone, but pottery. And inside those broken jars were scrolls, thousands of years old, wrapped in linen, covered in ancient ink, fragile as ash. This discovery would become one of the greatest archaeological finds of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And while most associate them with Israel archaeology and dusty museums, there's a deeper current, a shadowed corner of this story, where the Vatican quietly watches. Because some believe the Church didn't just observe the scrolls' discovery, they intervened. Let's step back. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a vast collection of nearly 1,000 manuscripts, written mostly in Hebrew Aramaic and some in Greek, hidden in the Qumran caves, likely by a Jewish sect called the Essenes, around the 1st century BCE. Among the texts were copies of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible, apocryphal writings never seen before, and fragments of unknown doctrines, cosmic wars, angelic battles, messianic prophecies. Many of these writings predate the earliest known versions of the Bible by centuries, and they don't always match. Some versions of Genesis are longer, others of Isaiah are different in tone. There are references to a teacher of righteousness, a messianic figure not named in any standard Christian canon, and descriptions of multiple messiahs, a kingly one and a priestly one. Such ideas could shake the foundations of faith, and for a time that's exactly what the Vatican feared. While Israel technically controlled the site, the scrolls study in the 1950s and 60s was led by a small circle of scholars, many of whom were Christian, some even ordained Catholic priests. And the Vatican maintained a quiet influence behind the scenes. Father Roland de Vaux, a French Dominican priest, led the initial excavation and analysis. Under his leadership, a tight group known as the Scrolls Team controlled access to the documents. Only they could study them. Only they could publish findings. For decades, most of the scrolls were kept secret, not lost, not undeciphered, just unpublished. Why? Critics, including many Jewish and secular scholars, accused the Vatican of deliberate suppression, that they feared how these texts might affect the Church's teachings, that they were sanitizing the past. And to some extent, those critics had a point. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly 50 years after their discovery, that pressure from scholars and journalists forced the release of high-resolution photographs of the entire collection. Only then did the broader academic world begin analyzing them freely. But even now, not everything has been made public. There are rumored fragments whispered among researchers and insiders that have yet to be shown. Lines that speak of a crucified teacher, of a resurrection event long before Jesus' time, of rituals involving divine names not spoken aloud in modern Judaism or Christianity. Some believe these fragments are held not in Israel, but in Vatican vaults, not stolen, gifted, acquired, or simply protected, because the Church has always been a steward of the sacred, and sometimes that means deciding when and if the world is ready. But the scrolls challenge more than history. They challenge the narrative. They show us a world where Judaism was not a monolith, but a tapestry filled with factions, visions, mystics. A time when religious thought was evolving, rapidly splintering and blooming. A time when Jesus would have been just one of many apocalyptic teachers walking deserts preaching renewal. To acknowledge this complexity might be thrilling to historians, but it's threatening to dogma. The Vatican knows this. That's why, even as it funds biblical archaeology and interfaith scholarship, it speaks carefully about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It praises them as a window into the ancient world, but rarely engages with their most controversial texts. And perhaps that's understandable, because within those jars were not just scriptures, but questions. Why were these scrolls hidden? Who feared their destruction? And what were they protecting? Some researchers believe the Essenes saw themselves as guardians of divine secrets, that they encoded prophecies, astronomical calendars, messianic signs, even timelines for the end of the age. One scroll, known as the War Scroll, describes a final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Not metaphor, not poetry, but a cosmic war complete with battle orders, weaponry, and angelic generals. It reads like a vision or a warning. Another, the Temple Scroll, outlines a blueprint for a massive new temple different from the one in Jerusalem. Taller, holier, protected by laws so strict that even unclean thoughts could desecrate its ground. And then there's the Copper Scroll, not made of parchment, but hammered onto metal. It lists 64 hidden locations where vast treasures of gold and silver were supposedly buried along with sacred artifacts. Some believe these were items from the original temple hidden before the Roman siege. Others think the Copper Scroll is symbolic. But what if it isn't? What if the Vatican has quietly investigated those sites? What if something was found? We may never know, but here's the deeper mystery. The Church was built on Scripture, on the belief that the Bible, though vast and complex, is complete. But the scrolls remind us there were other voices, other prophets, other truths, and for a faith that reveres tradition, that's not an easy idea. So the Vatican steps lightly, acknowledging the scrolls, but never bowing to them. And in doing so, it preserves a paradox, that to protect belief, sometimes you must hide the past. But tonight, as you lie beneath your blankets, let your mind wander to those caves, dry, silent, filled with dust and wind and the scent of salt, and jars, lined in rows, guarding stories the world was never meant to forget. And perhaps in a vault beneath Rome, another jar rests, unopened, waiting, because truth like prophecy arrives when we're ready, not when we demand it. In a quiet Portuguese valley in the spring of 1917, something strange began to happen. 3 children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, were tending sheep when a sudden flash of light startled them. But it wasn't lightning. It was a woman shining brighter than the sun, standing atop a small holm oak tree. She said she came from heaven, and over the next 6 months she returned. Each time the children reported visions, prophecies, and secrets. This became known as the Miracle of Fatima, a series of Marian apparitions that would be witnessed in part by over 70,000 people on October 13, 1917, when the sun itself was said to dance and spin in the sky. But it's not the miracle that continues to trouble minds inside the Vatican. It's the secrets. The children claimed that the Virgin Mary gave them 3 messages, warnings, or revelations meant for the world. 2 of them were made public early on, but the third, that was different. The third secret of Fatima became one of the most closely guarded mysteries in Catholic history. Let's look at what we know. The first secret was a vision of hell, a terrifying glimpse of lost souls in fire described with childlike yet vivid horror. The second was a prediction of World War II should humanity fail to repent, along with a warning about the rise of Soviet communism and the need to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But the third, Lucia, the eldest of the children, wrote it down in 1944 under instruction from her bishop. She sealed it in an envelope and delivered it to the Vatican, with one instruction. It was not to be revealed until 1960. Why 1960? Lucia never gave a reason, only saying that by then it will be clearer. And so for years the envelope sat in silence. Popes read it. Some wept. Others remained cold. But the people, they were left to wonder what could be so dangerous, so world-altering, that it had to be hidden. By 1960, when the Vatican refused to reveal the contents, speculation exploded. Some believed it foretold the end of the world. Others said it warned of a great apostasy within the Church itself. There were whispers of a false pope, of spiritual betrayal, of a war that would begin in the skies. Some even suggested the secret involved the assassination of a pope. And then, decades later, on June 26, 2000, the Vatican finally released a document claiming to be the third secret. It described a vision, a bishop in white, walking through a ruined city, stepping over corpses, weeping before being killed by soldiers on a hill beside a cross. A powerful image, but not a clear one. The Vatican interpreted it as a symbolic foretelling of the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II, who had been shot in St. Peter's Square but survived. Yet not everyone was convinced. Even prominent Catholic scholars and cardinals voiced their doubts. Where was the text? The words of Mary herself? This release felt incomplete, more like a vision than a message. Lucia had once said the secret was a direct quote from the Virgin. But what the Vatican revealed in 2000 contained no such thing. And so a new theory emerged. Part of the secret was never published. That perhaps there were two parts, one vision, one interpretation. And the second part, still locked away. Some suggest that the real third secret spoke of a massive spiritual collapse within the Church, a loss of faith from the inside, a turning away from truth. In fact, Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, once hinted that the unrevealed portion involved dangers threatening the faith and the life of the Christian and the importance of the last times. Cryptic, but heavy. There's also the question of why the secret was kept so long. John III read it and declined to publish. Paul VI read it and said nothing. John Paul I read it and died 33 days into his papacy. Only John Paul II, after surviving an assassination attempt on the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, took steps to reveal it, but even then, only in part. What frightened them, or what were they protecting? Lucia died in 2005 at the age of 97, having spent most of her life in a cloistered convent. In her final interviews, she remained vague about the third secret, neither confirming nor denying the Vatican's version. But those who knew her say she hinted that the secret involved a crisis of faith, a warning not of fire or war, but of spiritual blindness, a church distracted by politics, a world deaf to the divine. Perhaps that's why the Vatican hesitated, because a message about nuclear war is terrifying, but a message about internal collapse is far more dangerous, because it suggests that the enemy is not outside the gates, it's within, and that kind of message, that kind of truth, is not easy to share, especially from the pulpit. But tonight, as you lie in the soft glow of mystery, imagine this: a folded page, handwritten, fragile, tucked inside a small envelope. Inside the envelope, a note to be opened only in 1960. And beneath that, words not meant to comfort, but to awaken. Not prophecy, not fear, but warning of a faith that might lose its way, of light flickering out not from violence, but from forgetting. The secret perhaps is not about death at all, but about silence and the cost of turning away. So the next time you hear of Fatima, or see a statue of the Virgin standing with open hands and downcast eyes, remember some messages are spoken softly, but echo forever. It was an ordinary summer evening in Rome, June 22, 1983. A 15-year-old girl named Emanuela Orlandi, the daughter of a Vatican employee, left her music lesson. She was seen outside the conservatory. She spoke with a friend. She may have talked to a man offering her a job handing out flyers, and then she vanished. No struggle, no signs of distress, just gone, into the silence of the city. For most people, this would be a personal tragedy. A missing persons case, tragic but isolated. But Emanuela Orlandi's story is not just a mystery. It's a door, one that opens into some of the darkest, most tangled corridors of the modern Vatican. Let's begin with the facts. Emanuela was a Vatican citizen, one of a tiny handful of people in the world who live within the walls of the smallest country on earth. Her father worked for the prefecture of the papal household. Her family lived inside Vatican City itself. When she disappeared, it wasn't just an Italian girl who went missing. It was a Vatican girl, and that changed everything. Within days, strange calls began arriving. Anonymous voices claiming responsibility. One caller said Emanuela was being held in exchange for the release of Mehmet Ali Aka, the man who had attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II 2 years earlier. Another claimed she had been kidnapped by a group linked to Bulgarian intelligence. And then, silence. For years, theories multiplied, and the Vatican, it said almost nothing. This silence became its own kind of mystery, because while the Orlandi family pleaded for help, met with church officials, begged for answers, the Vatican rarely intervened. It treated the case as an Italian matter, even though the girl had disappeared from within its orbit. That silence grew louder. People began to wonder, what was the church not saying? One theory suggested that Emanuela had been kidnapped as part of a political operation leverage against the Vatican to influence Cold War diplomacy. Another alleged that she had been taken by a criminal ring operating within the Vatican Bank, perhaps as a warning related to financial secrets or blackmail. And still another, far darker theory proposed that she had become the victim of abuse, hidden away by individuals inside the church who feared exposure. In 2012, nearly 30 years later, a new voice emerged. A former member of a mafia group called Banda della Magliana claimed that the gang had been involved in Emanuela's disappearance, allegedly acting on behalf of a high-ranking Vatican official. He said her body was buried in a secret tomb, but when investigators opened the tomb, he identified it was empty, no remains, just stone. The mystery deepened. In 2018, a new letter arrived, an anonymous tip sent to the Orlandi family. It pointed to a specific tomb beneath the Vatican itself, the resting place of two 19th-century princesses in the Teutonic Cemetery, a small graveyard just inside Vatican walls. The letter claimed Emanuela was buried there, so with the Vatican's rare permission, the tombs were opened in 2019. And once again, nothing. No bones, not even the princesses. The tombs were completely empty. It was as if even the dead had vanished. Why? No one knows. The Vatican called it a mystery. The family called it a cover-up. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the disappearance. It's the pattern of avoidance, the long delays, the denial of access to documents, the refusal to share internal Vatican files even when requested by Italian prosecutors. There's an uncomfortable possibility that someone inside the church knows what happened, and they've kept it quiet. Some claim the Vatican's motive was to protect reputations. Others believe it was about shielding the church from legal exposure. A few go further, suggesting that Emanuela's case is part of a larger network of abuse, one that reaches deeper than most want to admit. In 2023, on the 40th anniversary of Emanuela's disappearance, her family renewed their plea for the Vatican to declassify its documents on the case. Pope Francis acknowledged the tragedy, offering prayers and sympathy, but the documents remain sealed, and the Orlandis are still waiting. This is not a story with a clean ending. No arrests, no closure, just a missing girl, a grieving family, and a trail of half-truths, broken leads, and long shadows. But what makes this mystery so powerful, so uniquely Vatican, is the contrast. The Church, with its centuries of wisdom, its vaults of records, its moral authority, cannot or will not solve the disappearance of one of its own. A girl who grew up within its walls, who laughed in its courtyards, who vanished and became a symbol of the secrets we keep and the truths we bury. Tonight, as you lie back, imagine Emanuela's footsteps echoing through the cobblestones of Vatican City, the hush of evening mass, the click of a rosary, then a silence, a long unanswered silence, and in that silence the weight of all that's been hidden. Because not all Vatican mysteries are ancient. Some are recent, some are still alive, and some still wait to come home. High above the rolling hills of central Italy, not far from the papal summer residence at Castel Gandolfo, sits a quiet dome. It's not made of gold. It doesn't house relics or saints. Inside there are no candles, no choir, only lenses, mirrors, and stars. This is the Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world, and perhaps one of the most surprising, because while the Vatican is known for its traditions, its doctrines, and its moral teachings, it is also watching the skies. Carefully, let's step into the quiet. The Vatican Observatory's roots stretch back to 1582, when Pope Gregory III initiated calendar reform, leading to the creation of the Gregorian calendar, which we still use today. That reform required precise astronomical measurements, and from that, a deeper interest in the heavens began to grow. By the late 1800s, Pope Leo III formalized the Church's commitment to scientific inquiry by founding what we now know as the Vatican Observatory, originally housed within Vatican City itself. But as the lights of Rome grew brighter, the stars grew fainter. So in 1935, the observatory was relocated to Castel Gandolfo, where a more modern telescope was installed. And then, in the 1980s, the Vatican took a step that raised eyebrows. It partnered with the University of Arizona to build a state-of-the-art telescope atop Mount Graham, one of the darkest, most pristine sky-viewing locations in the United States. The result? The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, VAT, a powerful instrument quietly peering into the vastness of the cosmos. But here's where it gets intriguing. Why would the Vatican, a spiritual institution, invest so heavily in astronomy? The answer lies in a name you might not expect: Father José Gabriel Funes, a Jesuit priest, an astrophysicist, and former director of the Vatican Observatory. In 2008, he made headlines around the world when he stated publicly that believing in extraterrestrial life does not contradict faith. The universe, he said, is so big it would be presumptuous to think we are the only ones. That statement was more than scientific curiosity. It was theological permission. For centuries, people have wondered how the existence of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe might challenge religious doctrine. Would it disprove the Bible? Undermine the idea of humanity's special place in creation? But the Vatican doesn't think so. Father Funes explained that other beings, if they exist, would still be part of God's creation. They might not have original sin. They might not require redemption the way humans do. Or they might have their own relationship with the Divine One we can't even comprehend. In other words, we're not the center of the story. And that's a radical idea, especially coming from an institution as old and rooted as the Catholic Church. But here's where the mystery deepens. Because the Vatican isn't just casually watching the skies, it's investing, studying, and some believe searching. There are whispers that the Church has been collecting astronomical data not just for science, but for prophecy. Some claim it's tied to the Book of Revelation, where stars fall and signs appear in the heavens. Others point to ancient Christian texts that speak of other worlds, other shepherds, and other flocks. One document, obscure, untranslated, mentions a second creation beyond the firmament, symbol, myth, or a clue. There are even rumors, speculative, unverified, but persistent, that some Vatican astronomers have observed anomalies in deep space. Moving lights, patterns that defy expectation, flashes that occur in rhythmic pulses too regular to be natural. Again, there is no public evidence of this, but the rumors endure. And then there's the name of one of the infrared instruments on Mount Graham, Lucifer. Not in fact the name of the Vatican's telescope itself, but a device used in coordination with it, the Large Binocular Telescope Near-Infrared Utility, with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research. A long name, a provocative acronym, unintentional perhaps, but striking. To some, it's merely an unfortunate coincidence. To others, it fuels the suspicion that the Vatican knows something it isn't saying. But what would that be? That we are not alone. That ancient scriptures were never meant to be earth-centric. That humanity's search for God is mirrored by others. There's one more name worth mentioning: Father Guy Consolmagno, a Jesuit brother astronomer and current director of the Vatican Observatory. He once said, "If we meet aliens and they're smarter than us, they might teach us new things about God." Let that settle in. Not fear, not threat, but learning from the stars. It's a beautiful idea, one that reshapes the very core of faith, not a ladder reaching up to heaven, but a web connecting us across the cosmos. And tonight, as you listen to this quiet journey through mystery, let your imagination drift upward, past the city lights, beyond the noise, into the great silence of space. There, imagine a small observatory on a mountaintop, a priest hunched over a console, not praying, not preaching, but watching, waiting, because sometimes the divine doesn't speak through scripture, it whispers in starlight. And the real Vatican secret might not be buried in a vault, but glowing gently at the edge of a telescope's gaze, waiting to be seen. Somewhere beneath the Vatican, beyond the marble halls and golden chapels, past the guarded doorways and the shadowed corridors, there is a vault. Its ceilings are high, the air is cold, and its contents priceless, not in gold or jewels, but in knowledge. This is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Secret Archive, not because it hides criminal plots, but because its documents are private, meant for popes, for cardinals, for those who are deemed ready. Inside lie thousands of years of letters, treaties, decrees, and books. Books we've never seen, books we may never see, and among them, if the whispers are true, lies a gospel. Not according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but according to Mary Magdalene. Let's return to the 1st century. Mary of Magdala appears in the Gospels as a devoted follower of Jesus. She is at the crucifixion. She is at the tomb. She is, according to multiple accounts, the first witness to the resurrection. But somewhere along the line, her story was changed. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory I declared her to be a repentant prostitute, though the Bible never calls her one. This confusion, intentional or not, shaped her legacy for over 1,000 years. But in 1896, something extraordinary was found in Egypt, a fragment of an early Christian gospel written in Coptic. It was called the Gospel of Mary, not the Virgin Mary, but Mary Magdalene. The text, incomplete and damaged, presents a startling vision. In it, Mary is portrayed not as a sinner, but as a leader, a disciple, a confidant of Jesus, one whom the other apostles question, not because of her sin, but because of her authority. Peter in the Gospel asks why Jesus would reveal hidden truths to her and not to the men. Mary responds with teachings she says were passed to her in private visions, parables, mysteries of the soul. It reads like a quiet rebellion, not against Christ, but against the structure that rose in his name. This gospel suggests that Mary may have been more than a follower. She may have been the most trusted, and that changes everything. Because if true, it means that the early church may have been more diverse than we know, that women played a larger, deeper role, that spirituality was not bound to hierarchy, but to understanding, and that some of the most sacred teachings were left out. Of course, the Church does not recognize the Gospel of Mary as canonical. It was never included in the New Testament. It wasn't officially condemned either, just forgotten. But scholars believe the text is ancient, possibly from the 2nd century, older than some canonical writings. And here's where the Vatican comes in. According to several researchers and one controversial whistleblower, a more complete version of the Gospel of Mary may exist within the Vatican archives, not a fragment, not a partial scroll, but a full preserved codex. If such a document exists, it has never been displayed. But the possibility has stirred debate. Why keep it hidden? Because it contradicts the traditional narrative, because it questions the hierarchy, or because it offers something more radical, a vision of faith based on inner revelation, not outer authority. The Gospel of Mary speaks of the soul's ascent after death, of passing through powers and confronting fears. It echoes the language of Gnostic thought: salvation through knowledge, not sacrifice. Some see this as heresy, others as enlightenment. To the Vatican, it is likely both, a threat and a treasure. In recent years, there's been a growing call for transparency. Scholars and theologians, many within the Church itself, have urged the Vatican to release any suppressed texts, gospels, letters, visions that might expand our view of early Christianity. The argument: faith should not fear the truth, but others warn that opening these doors could confuse the faithful, could erode confidence, could fragment the unity of doctrine that has endured for centuries. So the documents remain sealed, the vaults stay closed, and Mary Magdalene's voice waits. But her image has begun to change. In 2016, Pope Francis officially elevated her feast day, declaring her the Apostle to the Apostles, a powerful title, one that quietly corrects centuries of misrepresentation, a signal perhaps that the Church is ready to listen again, just not too loudly. And yet, in the silence, stories grow. Some say that Mary fled to France after the crucifixion, carrying teachings too dangerous to share in Jerusalem. Others say she carried a child, a bloodline, a legacy hidden in plain sight. These are legends, yes, but even legends begin somewhere, and when paired with a gospel ancient, real, and buried, they begin to feel less like fiction and more like fragments of a deeper truth. So tonight, as the world outside fades into stillness, picture a dim room beneath Rome, a single light, a table, and on it a leather-bound book, not gilded, not ornamented, just old, handwritten, waiting. Its cover bears no title, but inside line after line Mary speaks, not in protest, not in sorrow, but in clarity, because some truths don't shout, they whisper, until someone is quiet enough to hear. Picture a fortress, stone walls high and cold, a red cross emblazoned on white tunics, silent men on horseback bound not by blood, but by vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. These were the Knights Templar, warrior monks, guardians of pilgrims, custodians of secrets, and though centuries have passed since their banners flew over Jerusalem, their legacy endures. But beneath the legends of treasure and hidden maps lies something deeper, a connection to the Vatican. Let's step back to the year 1119. The Crusades had begun. Christian armies surged toward the Holy Land to reclaim sacred ground. Among them were a small group of knights led by Hugues de Payan, who offered a different kind of service protection, not of land, but of pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. They were given quarters on the Temple Mount, once the site of Solomon's temple. And from that sacred foundation came their name, poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or simply the Knights Templar. At first they were humble, but something changed. In 1129, they were officially endorsed by the Church at the Council of Troyes. Bernard of Clairvaux, a powerful abbot and theologian, championed them, writing the Templars' rule and praising their spiritual discipline. From then on, the Templars became the Church's favored order. They grew wealthy, influential, untouchable, and their power spread not just through Europe, but across the financial systems of the time. They created early forms of banking. Pilgrims could deposit money in one city, travel safely, and withdraw it elsewhere. Templar commanderies became centers of wealth and strategy, but with wealth came suspicion, and with secrecy, fear. Because what few talk about is what the Templars found beneath the Temple Mount. Some believe they uncovered ancient scrolls, texts older than Christianity, ritual objects, relics, even the Ark of the Covenant. Was it real? No one knows. But the Templars' power surged after their time in Jerusalem. Their structure grew, their rituals deepened, and whispers of hidden knowledge began to follow them. Some said they worshipped a strange figure called Baphomet. Others claimed they kept relics from the crucifixion, the Holy Grail, the lance that pierced Christ's side, even fragments of the cross. To the Church, these were dangerous rumors. But as long as the Templars served papal interests, they were protected, until they weren't. By the early 1300s, the political winds shifted. The Crusades had failed, the Holy Land was lost, and King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, began to plot. On Friday the 13th October 1307 he struck. Templars across France were arrested, accused of heresy, torture, blasphemy. The charges: Kissing idols, spitting on crosses, performing occult rituals. The truth, unclear. But the Vatican under Pope Clement V hesitated. He was caught between loyalties to the Church and to the King. Eventually, under pressure, the Pope disbanded the order. Their lands were seized, their leaders executed, and the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, reportedly cursing the Pope and the King as flames consumed him. Both would be dead within a year, but what happened next is the real mystery, because the Templars vanished. Their surviving members fled to Scotland, to Portugal, to parts unknown. Some changed their names. Others, it is said, carried with them secrets too dangerous to be destroyed. And some believe those secrets made their way back to the Vatican. Let's pause here, because for an organization as powerful as the Catholic Church, the Templars were both a gift and a threat. Their loyalty had once been unquestionable, but their knowledge, their independence, that made them dangerous. What exactly did they know? Some say they had documents that challenged the Church's official version of history records from the early centuries of Christianity. Alternative gospels, hidden doctrines, writings from ancient Jerusalem that painted a different picture of Jesus, perhaps as a teacher, a mystic, a man married to Mary Magdalene. Again, these are theories, but the Vatican's silence is deafening. Even today, references to the Templars in official church documents are rare. The archives from their trials are sealed or scattered, and efforts to rehabilitate their image have been slow. In 2007, the Vatican did quietly release a document, the Chignon Parchment, which revealed that Pope Clement V had absolved the Templar leadership of heresy in secret. The public never knew. The executions proceeded anyway. Why hide that? Why keep the truth buried? Unless the truth wasn't safe. But here's another thought. What if the Templars didn't die? What if they simply changed form? Their symbols, crosses, circles, swords appear across centuries, in cathedrals, in manuscripts, in the insignias of secret societies like the Freemasons, groups with rituals echoing Templar oaths, with knowledge whispered across generations. And the Vatican, it never denounces these echoes. It just watches, quietly, because some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some truths are too old to challenge. So tonight, as you drift in the stillness of thought, imagine a stone chamber beneath the Vatican. A box, iron-bound. Inside it, a scroll, a map, a sigil no longer in use, and next to it, a robe. White, with a red cross, folded, waiting, because history is not always erased. Sometimes it's just hidden, until the world is ready again. Deep inside the Vatican, past the ornate halls and gilded chapels, there lies a place most people will never see. A library. But not just any library. This is the Vatican Library, one of the most important repositories of knowledge in the world. It holds millions of manuscripts, some dating back to the earliest days of human civilization. Ancient scrolls, rare texts, forgotten books. It is a treasure trove. And yet, despite its vast wealth of knowledge, much of it is hidden from public view. The Vatican Library is open to scholars, but only the right scholars. There are layers of permissions requests and conditions. There are books that haven't been touched in centuries, and many more that have never been fully catalogued. But beyond the known manuscripts, there are secret collections, those that are kept away from even the most trusted historians and researchers. What's in those secret sections? What knowledge lies beyond the reach of the curious? That, it seems, is a question the Vatican has answered with silence. But there are stories. Over the centuries, rumors have circulated about a hidden library, a collection of books, maps, and writings that delve into areas of history and theology the Church would rather not discuss. Some say this hidden library contains ancient manuscripts that predate even the earliest Christian texts. Others suggest it contains books that were removed from the canon during the formation of the New Testament. One such book that has been whispered about for centuries is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which we've explored in earlier sections. In fact, it is rumored that not only does the Vatican possess a complete version of this gospel, but that it also has several other gospels that challenge the orthodox narrative of Christianity. Gospels that don't tell the story of Jesus as the Church has long described. These manuscripts aren't just about the life of Jesus. They also describe the early Christian world in ways that don't align with the teachings we know today. Some speak of alternative interpretations of salvation, others of hidden knowledge passed down from the apostles to the first followers of Christ. And yet, these texts have been kept secret. Why? Perhaps the answer lies in their contents. If these documents truly challenge the mainstream narrative of Christianity, they could shake the foundations of church doctrine. They could question the very nature of the Church's authority. They could disrupt centuries of tradition and belief. But some believe that the truth hidden for so long must eventually come to light. Among the Vatican's vaults are rumored to be even older texts predating the rise of Christianity itself. Some scholars and conspiracy theorists suggest that these books belong to a lost civilization, one whose records were hidden away in the Vatican's collections. A civilization whose understanding of the divine was far more mysterious, far more esoteric than what was accepted by later Christian doctrine. Could the Vatican really possess ancient forgotten knowledge? Knowledge that would redefine our understanding of religion history and even humanity's place in the universe? No one knows for sure, but the whispers persist. One of the most mysterious aspects of the Vatican Library is its restricted access. Certain sections of the library are so well guarded that no one except for the highest-ranking members of the Church can enter them. Even the most revered scholars can be denied access to certain texts. Some have speculated that these texts are not just theological writings, but documents of great political importance, deals and agreements that could shake the foundations of the Church. For example, some have suggested that hidden among these ancient papers are records of the Vatican's financial dealings with powerful European families, secret societies, and political leaders over the centuries. These records could reveal the true nature of the Vatican's wealth, how it acquired its vast land holdings, and what alliances it formed with the powers that ruled Europe. Then there's the question of the Vatican's connection to secret societies. The Church has long been associated with organizations like the Freemasons, the Knights Templar, and even more modern groups like the Opus Dei. Some researchers claim that certain texts in the Vatican Library reveal a connection between these groups, and that the Vatican itself may have used secret societies to maintain control over the spread of certain knowledge. This connection to secret societies is particularly troubling for some, as it suggests that the Vatican may have been complicit in activities that go against the core tenets of Christianity's secrecy, manipulation, and the pursuit of power. What's more unsettling is the continued secrecy surrounding the Vatican's archives. Why does the Church keep these documents hidden? Is it to protect its own reputation, or is it to protect humanity from truths it's not yet ready to face? Some argue that the Vatican holds these secrets not out of fear, but out of responsibility. That the Church has chosen to keep this knowledge hidden until the world is ready to understand it. But how long will that take? And when the truth finally does emerge, will it create a new wave of enlightenment or a new wave of chaos? There is also the issue of how the Vatican preserves these texts. Many of the manuscripts are fragile, old, and delicate. If these texts were to be made public, could they withstand the scrutiny of modern historians? Could they even survive the process of translation? Some of these documents are so obscure and complex that they have never been translated in full. They contain ideas, philosophies, and theological concepts that modern scholars can barely understand. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the Vatican holds on to these texts because they contain the keys to a forgotten world, a world that modern society, with its thirst for progress and enlightenment, has lost. Some even suggest that these texts could reveal hidden histories, forgotten cultures, civilizations that existed before recorded time. What if the Vatican's archives contain maps, documents, or relics that point to the existence of ancient cultures with knowledge far beyond our own. What if these ancient records hidden in plain sight hold the truth about our origins? The Vatican's silence on these matters has only intensified the speculation. For every document released, another is kept behind lock and key. For every rumor that leaks, more are buried in the archives sealed by time and secrecy. But in the quiet corners of the world, the whispers continue. Because even if the Vatican's library holds no great secret, even if it's only filled with old texts and manuscripts, what it represents is far more significant. It is a symbol of knowledge of power and of the lengths to which we will go to preserve our beliefs, our history, and our humanity. The Vatican's archives will remain a mystery, just as the city itself has always been, silent, waiting for the right moment, for the right time. And one day, perhaps someone will open the door and discover what lies behind it. In the hushed corners of candlelit monasteries and among parchment scrolls tucked into weathered bookshelves, there exists a list. A list written, it is said, nearly 900 years ago. A list of names, obscure phrases, cryptic mottos, each one meant to describe a future pope. This strange document is known as the Prophecy of the Popes, and it's often attributed to Saint Malachy, a 12th century Irish archbishop said to have experienced a sudden and powerful vision while on pilgrimage in Rome. According to the legend, Saint Malachy collapsed in ecstasy and began to dictate a series of Latin phrases, 112 in total. Each phrase was meant to describe a future pope from his own day, all the way to the last pope who would reign over the church in its final hour. The list was locked away for centuries before being published in the late 1500s by a Benedictine monk named Arnold Wyon. And what makes this prophecy so mysterious is not just its content, but how eerily accurate some of the descriptions seem to be. Let's begin with an example. Pope John Paul I, who reigned for only 33 days in 1978, is associated with the motto De Medietate Lunae, or of the half moon. He was born during a half moon, elected pope during another, and died before the next full cycle. Coincidence? Perhaps. Then there's Pope John Paul II de Labore Solis, or from the labor of the sun. He was born on a solar eclipse and buried on the day of another. Again, it may be chance, but many have pointed to these phrases with growing unease, especially as the Church reached the final names on the list. The second to last pope is associated with the phrase Gloria Olivae, the glory of the olive. Some interpreted this to symbolize peace, others linked it to the Benedictine order, as Pope Benedict XVI took the name just before resigning. And then we come to the final entry, the last pope. And this is what the prophecy says. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock amid many tribulations, after which the seven-hilled city will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge the people. The end. That's it. No cryptic motto, no name, just a dire warning of persecution, collapse, and judgment. Now some claim that Pope Francis, who currently leads the Church, is this Peter the Roman. Although he is not Roman by birth, his chosen name honors Saint Francis of Assisi, who was born Giovanni di Pietro Pater di Bernardone. Is that enough to match the prophecy? No one can say for certain. But what's unsettling is how the prophecy abruptly ends after this final pope, as if there is no future beyond him. No more popes, no more church, only the end. So the question arises, is the prophecy authentic? Skeptics argue that the earlier descriptions of popes in the prophecy are remarkably accurate, while the later ones grow vague and symbolic. They suggest that the list may have been forged in the 16th century to legitimize the papal ambitions of Cardinal Girolamo Simoncelli. And yet, the last few entries post-publication still seem to reflect real events. Coincidence? Or something deeper? The Vatican has never officially recognized the prophecy as valid, but neither has it condemned it outright. It exists in a strange liminal space discussed by scholars, whispered among the faithful, and mostly ignored by the Church's hierarchy. And that silence speaks volumes. Because whether true or not, the prophecy of the popes taps into a much older fear, that all things, even divine institutions, must come to an end, and that perhaps the church, like all empires, has a lifespan written not in stone, but in stars. But what does the end of the church mean? Does it mean physical destruction, a collapse of cathedrals and doctrines, or something more subtle, a loss of faith, a crumbling from within, a slow forgetting of the sacred in a world that moves faster than prayer? Perhaps the true tribulation is not fire from heaven, but a kind of spiritual erosion, a turning away from the divine. And if that's the case, then the prophecy is not just a forecast. It's a warning that without vigilance, without renewal, even the most sacred institutions can falter. But here's where we pause, because bedtime is not a place for dread. It's a place for thought, and perhaps for hope. The church has endured much invasions, reformations, scandals, and schisms, and yet it remains a beacon for some, a symbol for others, a mystery always. Maybe the end is not destruction, but transformation, a new way of understanding the sacred, a return to humility, to silence, to awe. And tonight, as you listen to these quiet reflections, let the echo of the prophecy stir in you, not fear, but curiosity. Picture the 7 hills of Rome bathed in moonlight. Picture a lone figure in white walking beneath the dome of St. Peter's, not fleeing, not trembling, but listening. Because even at the end of all things, there is still one voice that remains, the whisper of the soul, asking questions, reaching upward, and reminding us that prophecy is not about knowing the future. It's about remembering the past and living the present with care. Let your mind wander now to the deep hush of a medieval monastery. Stone walls, flickering torches, the smell of vellum and old ink. In a candlelit room, a single monk sits hunched over a massive book, his quill scratching in rhythmic strokes. His task, to write the greatest manuscript the world has ever seen. But this is no ordinary book. It is a codex so large it requires 2 people to lift it. A book so ominous that legend says it was written with the help of Satan himself. They call it the Codex Gigas, Latin for giant book, but more commonly it is known as the Devil's Bible. And somewhere deep within the Vatican, behind layers of locks and silence, the church may hold missing fragments of it, or worse, knowledge of its origin that it never dared to share. Let's open its cover slowly. The Codex Gigas was created in the early 13th century in the Kingdom of Bohemia in what is now the Czech Republic. Thought to be the work of a single monk, the book contains the entire Bible, plus a host of additional texts, a medical encyclopedia, a calendar, magic formulas, and penitential prayers. But what draws the world's attention is one haunting page, a full-page illustration of the devil. He stands alone, horned and clawed against a void of black and red. It is unlike anything in any other religious manuscript. No saints, no angels, just him, staring outward, mocking or warning. According to legend, the scribe who created the Codex Gigas broke his monastic vows and was sentenced to be walled up alive. In desperation, he promised to write a book containing all human knowledge in a single night. When the task became impossible, he is said to have made a pact with the devil, who completed the work in exchange for his soul. And as a tribute, the monk added the devil's portrait. Of course, that's the legend. But the truth is equally strange. Modern scholars have studied the manuscript's handwriting and concluded that the entire book likely was written by a single person, and yet there are no variations in style, no signs of fatigue, no errors in format or rhythm. It's as if it were created in one sustained effort. How is that possible? Was the monk extraordinarily disciplined, or was something else at work? And here's where the Vatican enters the picture. Though the Codex Gigas is now housed in the National Library of Sweden, it once belonged to the Habsburg rulers, and before that, it passed through ecclesiastical hands, including, according to some accounts, a brief and undocumented presence within the Vatican. Why would the Vatican take interest in such a strange book? Because of what it contains. The Codex Gigas does not just include scripture. It also holds forbidden knowledge texts once considered heretical or occult. It references exorcism rituals, magic incantations, cures for ailments and diseases based on ancient humoral theory. It even includes an account of how to contact spirits. And then there's the image of the devil himself, so disturbingly placed in the middle of sacred scripture. To the Church, this book represents a theological contradiction. Is it sacred? Is it profane? Is it both? Some scholars believe the Vatican may possess other volumes, like the Codex Gigas books, written on the edge of faith and heresy, kept hidden to avoid confusion or scandal. Others suggest the Vatican may hold annotations or alternate translations of the Codex that hint at a deeper purpose, perhaps an esoteric tradition meant only for the highest initiates. And while none of this can be proven, the lack of transparency only feeds the mystery. Why has the Vatican never spoken publicly about the Codex Gigas? Why are references to it absent in church archives? Why does it remain officially outside the Church's concern, yet rumored to have been studied in secret? There's a theory, a quiet one, that the Devil's Bible is not evil because of its content, but because of what it reveals, a time when faith and fear walked hand in hand, when monasteries were not just places of worship, but laboratories of the arcane. A time when monks believed that God was light, and to understand him fully, one must also know the dark. And maybe, just maybe, the Church remembers that time and fears it, because power, even holy power, must be handled with care, especially when it comes wrapped in parchment sealed in ink and stamped with a clawed hand. So tonight, as you rest beneath the calm of your own quiet sanctuary, picture this: a dim vault beneath St. Peter's, rows of forgotten books, and there, resting on a stone pedestal, a single page, yellowed, heavy, and covered in a script that no one dares to read aloud. In the center, a drawing, not of angels, but of him, not because he is worshipped, but because he was witnessed, once, long ago, and remembered ever since, because some books aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be kept, and watched, and never ever opened after dark. In the soft hills of central Portugal, just beyond olive groves and winding roads, there's a small town with a quiet name, Fatima. It was there in the spring and summer of 1917 that something began. Something strange, something holy, or perhaps something still misunderstood. 3 shepherd children, Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco, were tending sheep when a figure appeared to them. Radiant, gentle, glowing in white light. They said it was the Virgin Mary who spoke to them over the course of 6 separate visits. These apparitions became known as the Miracle of Fatima, and by the final one, in October, over 70,000 people had gathered in the fields to witness what the children had foretold. What they saw became one of the most documented and widely attested miracles in modern Catholic history, the so-called Miracle of the Sun. Eyewitnesses, believers, and skeptics alike reported the sun dancing in the sky, changing colors, zigzagging and spinning like a disc, before returning to its normal state. But beyond the spectacle, the children claimed something more: secrets. The lady, they said, had given them 3 secrets messages from heaven. The first was a vision of hell. The second foretold the end of World War I, the rise of another, and the dangers of Russia's growing power and atheism. But it's the third secret that remains the Vatican's greatest enigma. For decades it was withheld, locked in an envelope, passed between popes, read in silence, and never revealed to the public. Why? What was so disturbing that even the Church couldn't speak it aloud? Theories grew. Some said it contained a prophecy of the end times. Others believed it warned of a pope's assassination or the destruction of the Church from within. A few even claimed it predicted the fall of faith itself, a spiritual apocalypse unlike anything humanity has faced before. In 2000, after intense public pressure and countless conspiracy theories, the Vatican finally released what it claimed was the full text of the third secret. It described a vision, a bishop in white walking through a ruined city filled with corpses praying for the dead before being shot and killed alongside others. The Vatican interpreted this as a symbolic prediction of the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II, who was gravely wounded in St. Peter's Square, but survived. According to church officials, the secret had been fulfilled, but many were not convinced. The language of the secret as released was poetic and ambiguous, more dreamlike than prophetic. Even Sister Lucia, the last surviving visionary, was reported to have said that the version revealed by the church was incomplete and that the full message involved a great loss of faith within the church itself. A crisis from the inside, not from foreign armies or external threats. A spiritual rot. And then, there's the envelope. According to some sources close to the Vatican, there were two documents, one, a vision, the other, an interpretive letter that described the Virgin's actual spoken words that have never been released. Cardinal Bertone, who played a key role in the release of the secret in 2000, denied this. But questions remain. Why did Pope John XXIII read the third secret and refuse to publish it, saying, "This does not concern my time"? Why did Pope Paul VI also choose silence? And why did Pope John Paul II, who had a deep devotion to Mary, read the secret shortly after his election and reportedly weep? If it was simply a vision of a shooting, why the tears? Unless the true secret speaks of something darker, a betrayal, a spiritual collapse, a time when the church itself is shaken not by war, but by truth. It's worth noting that Fatima has always carried an undercurrent of urgency. The second secret called for the consecration of Russia to Mary's Immaculate Heart. Many believe this consecration was not properly done until much later, and that delays may have triggered spiritual consequences. But the third secret, it was meant to be revealed by 1960. Instead, it sat sealed for 40 years, until the world had changed and questions could no longer be avoided. And yet even now, the answers feel incomplete. To this day, some Catholic theologians, historians, and even bishops have publicly expressed doubts about the full release of the secret. A few claim that the Church, in trying to protect the faithful, may have decided that the truth was too destabilizing, that fear of mass panic or theological disillusionment drove them to redact the most explosive elements. We'll never know for certain. The Vatican holds its documents tightly. Sister Lucia died in 2005, and what remains is a silence more powerful than any sermon. A silence that begs the question, what could heaven have said that the Church could not repeat? So tonight, as the world rests in its twilight hush, picture a simple envelope, yellowed with time, sealed. Inside not fire or thunder but words, softly spoken, perhaps only a few sentences, but enough to shake stone, enough to make popes pause, and bishops weep, because some messages are not meant for the pulpit, they are meant for the soul. And perhaps that is the true third secret, not a prediction of death or disaster, but a quiet warning that even the brightest lights can flicker, that faith once lost is harder to regain than we think, and that the greatest miracle is belief that endures even when the sky does not dance. Now, imagine this. Beneath the marble floors of the Vatican, past archives and whispers behind locked doors and silent guards, there lies a room, not filled with books, not lined with relics, but with a machine, a device unlike anything else, a device, it is said, that lets you see through time. No, this isn't a scene from a movie. It's the heart of one of the Vatican's most extraordinary and least acknowledged legends, the story of the chronovisor. A strange name for a stranger object. The chronovisor is said to be a type of time viewer, not a time machine, in the sense of moving through time physically, but a screen, a portal that reveals visual and auditory glimpses of events from the past, not as they were imagined, but as they actually happened. Let's trace the origin of this idea. In 1972, an Italian priest named Father François Brune published a book titled Le Nouveau Mystère du Vatican, the Vatican's New Mystery. In it, he recounted a secret shared with him by another priest, Father Pellegrino Ernetti. Ernetti was no mystic. He was a Benedictine monk, but also a physicist, a scholar, and a musicologist who who worked with the Catholic Church and taught at several universities. And according to Ernetti, he had helped construct a device that could see through time. With a team of scientists, including he claimed the famous physicist Enrico Fermi, they had developed the chronovisor using principles of sound and electromagnetic energy. The theory was radical, that all events once they happened left behind a kind of cosmic residue. Waves, frequencies, vibrations imprinted into the fabric of reality, and with the right equipment, these waves could be retrieved, amplified, and converted into images. A spiritual radio tuned to history itself. Ernetti claimed the device resembled a large cabinet with controls and dials and a viewing screen. He said he had personally witnessed a number of historical scenes using it, including the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. In one of the most astonishing claims, he stated the team had seen Christ's final moments, heard the sounds, seen the expressions, even transcribed the Latin spoken by Roman soldiers. Later, Ernetti reportedly produced a photograph of Jesus taken from the chronovisor. The image was grainy, haunting, a face twisted in suffering, eyes closed, crowned with thorns. But skeptics quickly pointed out its resemblance to a known artistic sculpture housed in a church in Italy, and the photo was soon dismissed as a hoax. Ernetti, pressed later in life, seemed to retract some of his claims, and yet, he never fully denied the existence of the chronovisor. Before his death in 1994, he told Brune the Vatican knows. They have it. They chose silence. And that is where the mystery deepens. Because according to the legend, the chronovisor was confiscated by the Vatican and placed under lock and key. Not destroyed, hidden. Why? Perhaps because of what it could reveal. Imagine the implications. If such a device existed, it could verify or disprove religious events. It could show the truth behind miracles, testaments, scripture. It could unravel history or solidify it. And for the church, that's a double-edged sword. Because what if the truth doesn't match the teachings? What if events considered sacred were in fact symbolic? Or worse, misremembered? To maintain faith, sometimes it's safer to leave the past unwatched. The Vatican, when asked, has never commented directly on the chronovisor. It is not officially acknowledged in any document. No photographs, no blueprints, no comment. But in 1988, the Vatican did issue a curious statement. It warned that anyone using or attempting to use an instrument of such kind, one capable of seeing the past, would be subject to excommunication. Why issue a warning for a device that doesn't exist? Unless the idea was not as fictional as it seemed. Modern physicists have speculated on similar concepts. The idea that time as a dimension may be observable in indirect ways, that particles retain history, that sound and light may be trapped in matter like fossils. But to build a device that translates these echoes into images, that crosses the border between science and the sacred. Still, the idea remains, and it stirs something deep. Because whether the chronovisor is real or not, it represents a longing we all carry, to witness the past, to know, not through books, not through faith, but through our own eyes, to stand beside the pyramids as they were built, to hear the Sermon on the Mount, to see Leonardo mix his paints, to watch in silence as time unfurls its petals. But would it bring us peace, or would it disturb us? Would seeing the past free us, or bind us to truths we can't change? And maybe that's why, if the chronovisor ever did exist, it had to be hidden. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. So tonight, in the quiet edges of your imagination, picture a darkened chamber beneath Vatican stone, a polished cabinet, dust on its switches, the hum of silence as power courses through its core, and on a screen, faint at first, then clearer, a scene from 2,000 years ago. A voice speaking Aramaic, a crowd listening, a man barefoot walking toward his fate. Not a legend, not a story, but a moment, real and remembered, because time does not forget. Only we do. And somewhere, perhaps in the stillness of the Vatican's deepest vaults, time is waiting to be watched again. You've heard the whispers, stories of possession, of voices that aren't human, of children speaking ancient tongues, of eyes that see through you. These are not tales from films or novels. They're taken from records, real accounts preserved, studied, and in some cases, sealed by the Church. Because while the modern world may scoff, the Vatican still takes exorcism very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that it trains specialists, maintains guidelines, and according to some houses, a secret archive of documented possessions and demonic phenomena so vast it rivals the theological library itself. Let's begin with what we know. The Catholic Church has a formal rite of exorcism updated in 1999 from its 17th century version. The ritual is ancient, its words Latin, its structure rigid. It involves holy water, crucifixes, relics, prayers, and above all, belief. But what many people don't realize is that before an exorcism can occur, a lengthy process must unfold. Medical exams, psychiatric evaluation. A priest must determine whether what's occurring is illness or something other. Only when all earthly causes have been ruled out can the rite be approved. And who approves it? In many cases, Rome. There exists within the Vatican an office responsible for overseeing exorcisms and paranormal claims. This role, often discreet, is supported by certain clergy known only by title, not by name. They operate away from cameras. Their reports rarely reach the public, but their numbers are growing. In recent years, the Vatican has increased exorcist training programs, citing a rise in reported possessions, particularly in Italy, Poland, Latin America, and parts of Africa. Are these spiritual attacks, or something psychological? The Church often refuses to say, but priests on the ground will tell you some cases defy all logic. Voices coming from nowhere, objects moving in locked rooms, victims reacting violently to holy water, while remaining calm with regular tap. But what's more intriguing is what's been quietly collected over centuries. It is said that the Vatican keeps an archive not just of exorcism rites, but of field notes, eyewitness reports, tapes, photographs, personal letters from clergy who encountered things they never wanted to see again. Some of these files, it's rumored, are considered too disturbing for even seasoned exorcists. They're sealed, categorized, restricted. Why? Because the Church knows what few dare to believe. The battle between good and evil is not always metaphor. Sometimes it is loud, violent, immediate, and sometimes it wins. But the Vatican's concern with the demonic isn't just practical, it's theological. Demonic possession touches on the question of free will sin and the fragility of the soul. It forces theologians to reckon with why God allows such things and how evil manifests in the human world. And that opens doors the Church doesn't always want opened. Some exorcists have spoken of shared experiences, cases where people miles apart speak the same phrases in forgotten languages, where symbols appear burned into skin without contact, where entire households fall into chaos for no apparent reason. What connects these cases? Are they random or part of something larger? Here's where it gets darker. There are whispers of specialized priests trained beyond the traditional rite, those who investigate not just individual possessions, but locations, cursed sites, homes built atop desecrated ground, objects imbued with something wrong. And it is said that these priests report back to a hidden Vatican commission, a group that reviews, categorizes, and archives the most troubling phenomena. None of this is confirmed, of course. But then, neither is the Vatican's famous Room 440, an alleged sub-archive located beneath the main library, accessible only to those with direct permission from the Pope. Room 440 is said to house demonic cases deemed too dangerous to release, bound books pages redacted, audio tapes labeled in Latin, handwritten notes in trembling script, and always the instruction, "Do not open alone." What does the Vatican fear? Perhaps nothing more than knowledge without preparation. Because to know the full extent of evil is to risk drawing its attention. Still, some reports have made their way into the public. In 1949, a case involving a boy in Maryland became the inspiration for the novel The Exorcist. Though names were changed, the event was real. Jesuit priests performed multiple rites, diaries were kept, phenomena were recorded, and the Vatican monitored it quietly from afar. That case ended in healing, but not all do. Some are silenced, covered up, not to deceive, but to protect. Or so the Church claims. And as night deepens, we're left with questions that don't resolve neatly. If exorcism is real, then so too is possession. And if possession is real, what else might be? Are demons singular, or are they part of something organized? Are they fallen angels, or echoes of ancient gods? Theologians argue, but answers are scarce. What remains are stories. A diary locked in a priest's drawer, a scream echoing through an old church wall, a chair that moved when no one was near it, and a vault in the Vatican with a lock no one speaks of. So tonight, in the hush of your room, let yourself feel the chill not of fear, but of mystery. Not every shadow is evil. Not every silence is empty. But some truths like demons hide in plain sight until they're named, and naming them is where the danger begins. Now let the night take us to the oldest stone corridors of the Christian world, where dust clings to forgotten scrolls and memory drips like candle wax. We're going back not just to the first centuries of the Church, but to the first witnesses, to one woman, to Mary Magdalene. Her name appears in every gospel. She stood at the cross. She discovered the empty tomb. She was the first to speak to the risen Christ, and yet her voice was later silenced. For centuries she was miscast, branded a harlot, turned into a cautionary tale, then quietly pushed aside in favor of male disciples. But beneath the surface, beneath dogma and dust, something remained. Her gospel, or at least the fragments of it, because there exists a text long buried in Egypt, forgotten in the sands of time, known as the Gospel of Mary. It is not part of the Bible, but it might have been if history had unfolded differently. Discovered in the late 19th century and later confirmed by the Nag Hammadi Library, finds in 1945, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is a Gnostic text. Its pages are few, its condition worn, but what survives is nothing short of radical. In it, Mary is not a background character. She is a teacher, a confidant, a spiritual equal to the apostles. She describes visions, encounters with the divine, and most provocatively, she comforts the male disciples when they are afraid, offering them words of wisdom straight from the Christ they had followed. One passage, soft but firm, reads, "Do not weep and be not grieved nor irresolute, for his grace will be entirely with you and will protect you." Another disciple questions her authority, saying, "Did he really speak privately to a woman rather than to us?" To which another replies, "If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" In that moment, something old stirs. A female voice, clear and strong, echoing across 2 millennia. But here's the mystery. Why was this gospel lost? Or worse, hidden? Some scholars believe the Gospel of Mary was deliberately excluded during the early canonization of Scripture, not because it was false, but because it presented a version of Christianity where women had power, where the divine spoke not just to Peter and Paul, but to Mary, and not just as a witness, but as a teacher of truth. That challenged the hierarchy, and perhaps the Church wasn't ready. So what does the Vatican know of this gospel? Officially, it's regarded as apocryphal, a text of interest, yes, but not divinely inspired. Unofficially, there are whispers that the Vatican's archives hold additional fragments, letters from early Christian women, poetry attributed to Magdalene, even suppressed writings by early church fathers who supported her role as a leader. None of this can be confirmed, but silence too speaks volumes. For centuries, Mary Magdalene was deliberately recast not as a spiritual teacher, but as a sinner. It wasn't until Pope Gregory the Fern in the 6th century that she was publicly identified as a prostitute, despite no biblical evidence for it. That label remained for almost 400 years. Only in 1969 did the Church formally reverse its stance, acknowledging that Mary was never identified in Scripture as a fallen woman. But by then, the damage was done. The Magdalene of mystery had become the Magdalene of shame. And yet, her gospel still speaks. It speaks of internal revelation, of a kingdom not ruled from above but found within, of knowledge not given by bishops but accessed through the soul. In one preserved passage, Jesus tells her, "Where the mind is, there is the treasure." It's a vision of spirituality that feels almost modern, contemplative, mystical, personal, and it may be why her gospel was buried not just in sand, but in silence, because her truth could not be tamed, and yet it survived. Now in our time, theologians, feminists, and seekers of all kinds are returning to her words. They are asking what it means that the first witness to resurrection was a woman, that the first preacher of the risen Christ wasn't a priest, but a follower with nothing but her voice. And that maybe, just maybe, the Gospel of Mary wasn't lost by accident. It was left out on purpose. So tonight, let the image settle gently in your mind. A candlelit cave, a scroll nearly crumbling held by hands that have been silenced for centuries, ink faded, words trembling, but still legible, still speaking, still waiting to be heard. And in those words, a woman, not bowing, not begging, but standing and teaching, not with sermons, but with soul. She has no pulpit, no mitre, no vestments, only presence, only truth. And maybe that's why they feared her. Because the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is not about power or punishment. It's about awakening. It's about remembering that the divine does not whisper to hierarchies. It whispers to hearts. Even now, even here, even in you. Close your eyes now and picture a long linen cloth, pale and old, with faint brown markings stretched across its surface. At first glance, it seems ordinary. But step closer and a face begins to emerge. Eyes closed, beard, mustache, a crown of wounds. And then you see the full form of a man's body, front and back, as though wrapped completely in fabric. This is the Shroud of Turin, perhaps the most studied, most contested, and most mysterious relic in all of Christianity. It is said to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ himself, and though it resides in a cathedral in Turin, Italy, the Vatican holds the keys to its legacy, both in terms of possession and in what it chooses to reveal. Let's begin with what the shroud actually is. It's a linen cloth roughly 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. On it appears the faint image of a man who seems to have been crucified, complete with wounds in the wrists and feet, scourge marks on the back, and bloodstains consistent with a crown of thorns. To believers, it is the actual burial shroud used to wrap Jesus after the crucifixion, miraculously imprinted with his image at the moment of resurrection. To skeptics, it's a medieval forgery, a devotional artifact made to inspire faith during a time when relics were power. The Church, interestingly, has never taken an official position on its authenticity, but its actions suggest otherwise. The Vatican has guarded the shroud closely for centuries. It has limited access, controlled scientific studies. It allows public viewing only on rare occasions, sometimes separated by decades. Why? Perhaps to protect it, perhaps to preserve it, or perhaps because they know something they are not yet ready to share. In 1988, a team of scientists performed radiocarbon dating on a small sample of the shroud. The results came back quickly. The cloth, they said, dated from between 1260 and 1390 AD, a medieval artifact. And yet, something didn't sit right. The area tested, it turns out, may have been part of a repaired section woven centuries after the original cloth. Other experts pointed out that the image on the shroud was not made with paint pigment or dye. There were no brushstrokes, no signs of artificial application. Instead, the image appeared to be a kind of photonegative one that revealed startling detail when photographed for the first time in 1898. How could medieval artisans create something that behaves like a photographic plate, centuries before the invention of photography? There are also three-dimensional qualities to the image: depth and distance encoded in the fabric itself, as if the cloth recorded not just light, but form. No one knows how this would be possible. Then there's the blood. Analysis has shown that the stains are real human blood type AB, the same type found on several other sacred Christian relics, including some Eucharistic miracles. And in that blood, traces of trauma, not painted or dabbed, but consistent with high-velocity contact, like what would happen if a wounded body were suddenly wrapped under pressure. Suddenly. As in, resurrection. But perhaps the most compelling element is not the science, it's the silence. For years, researchers, theologians, even journalists have asked the Vatican for access to the full shroud to test additional fibers to explore the cloth with modern tools. The answer time and again is no, or rather not yet. They say it's to protect the relic, to avoid damage, to preserve its sacredness. But some whisper that the Vatican already knows more than it admits, that secret tests have been conducted, that discoveries have been made, and that those findings are held quietly within church walls. Why? Because the truth, whatever it may be, could shake the very foundation of belief. If the shroud is authentic, then it may be the only physical evidence of the resurrection in existence. A cloth that captured a moment between death and life, a relic that saw the face of God. But if it is not, if it is merely a brilliant creation of a pious artisan, then millions of faithful might question the stories they've grown up with. And so, the Church treads carefully, neither confirming nor denying, letting belief guide the soul more than science. And yet, the mystery remains. There are those who say the image was created by a burst of radiant energy, a kind of flash unlike anything known in nature. A spiritual explosion. Others believe the shroud is not from our time at all, but a relic left behind from an earlier civilization, one that understood light and material in ways we have not yet recovered. Still others see it as a symbol, a reminder that faith does not need proof, only presence. But wherever you stand, the image remains. It is quiet, it is solemn, it does not ask for belief, it simply is. So tonight, as the world slows and the stars hang heavy over the Vatican dome, picture the shroud not as a relic in glass, but as a cloth once carried, once folded, once laid across a body that had loved, suffered, and gone still. And now speaks again, not with words, but with silence, with texture, with mystery, because perhaps the greatest truths are not spoken from pulpits or carved in marble. They are whispered in cloth, and in that soft holy linen folded beneath a city of saints and secrets, something ancient is still waiting not to be solved, but to be seen. There's a small chapel tucked away in Rome, not far from the throngs of tourists, but quiet enough to feel forgotten. Inside, faded frescoes blend with candle smoke, and a breeze carries the faint scent of centuries-old incense. Somewhere within these sacred walls hangs a list, not carved in marble, not printed in scripture, but etched, some say, into prophecy. It's known as the Prophecy of the Popes, and it begins with a name, Saint Malachy. According to legend, Malachy was a 12th century Irish archbishop who traveled to Rome in 1139. During his visit, he collapsed in a vision, an overwhelming trance, in which he saw not just the glory of Rome, but the future of the papacy itself. When he awoke, he had written a list, 112 short cryptic Latin phrases, each describing a future pope. And at the end of that list, the destruction of the Church. For centuries, the manuscript lay forgotten in the Vatican's vaults until it surfaced in 1595, published by Benedictine monk Arnold Wion. Skeptics claim it was a forgery created to bolster the legitimacy of a favored papal candidate. But others note how eerily accurate the mottos have been when matched retrospectively to the personalities' coats of arms or life stories of subsequent popes. Each phrase is brief, mysterious. From the midst of the moon, glory of the olive, labor of the sun. These aren't names, they're symbols, clues, and when matched to popes across history, many seem to fit. Take Pastor et Nauta, shepherd and sailor, which appears to describe Pope John the Baptist, who came from Venice, a city of ships, and who saw himself as a shepherd of renewal. Or De Medietate Lunae, from the half of the moon, linked to Pope John Paul I, born during a half moon, elected during a half moon, and who died just 33 days later, under a half moon. Coincidence or pattern? The Vatican has never given the prophecy official recognition. It doesn't appear in catechism or canon law, but it circulates quietly in seminaries and whispered conversations. And now, we reach the end. According to the list, the 112th and final pope is described as, "In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock among many tribulations, after which the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge the people." No dates, no specifics, just a warning, and here's where things get strange. The current Pope, Pope Francis, is widely regarded as the 266th pontiff, but in the sequence of Malachi's prophecy, he would be the 112th, the last. Is Pope Francis Peter the Roman? Officially, no. He is Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina, not Rome, but he took the name Francis, not Peter. And yet, he has been deeply connected to the traditions of St. Peter, emphasizing humility, care for the poor, and global unity. Even more intriguingly, his father was an Italian immigrant from Piedmont, once part of the Roman territories. A Roman by blood, a shepherd by calling, and his reign, marked by crises, church scandals, financial struggles, global pandemics, geopolitical shifts, tribulations indeed. Does the prophecy foretell the end of the church or a transformation? Some interpret destruction symbolically as the end of a certain kind of church, not the end of faith. A fall not into fire, but into rebirth. Others fear a more literal reading. The city of 7 hills is unmistakably Rome. The dreadful judge may refer to divine judgment, or perhaps to a final reckoning, the collapse of religious authority as we've known it. But what does the Vatican believe? They won't say. In public, the prophecy is dismissed as superstition. In private, who knows? What is known is this: the Vatican has always had a complicated relationship with prophecy. It monitors Marian apparitions. It reviews mystic writings. It decides what is made public and what is not. And Malachi's list. It remains outside the Vatican's walls, yet always pressing in. When Pope John Paul II was asked about the prophecy, he responded only with a gentle smile and silence. When Pope Benedict XVI resigned in 2013, a shocking move almost without precedent, some saw it as a fulfillment of the penultimate motto, Glory of the Olive. Benedict was from the Order of Saint Benedict, whose symbol was the olive branch. And then came Francis, Pope 112, and now we wait, not for doom, but for clarity, for understanding, for what might come after. Because perhaps the prophecy isn't about fear. Perhaps it's about preparation, a spiritual call to remember that no human institution is eternal. Only the Spirit is, only faith endures. And maybe that's the lesson buried beneath the Latin riddles. That the church is not its walls, not its robes, not its treasures. It is its people, their hearts, their hopes, their prayers whispered into candlelight. So tonight, as the stars watch over St. Peter's Basilica, as the ancient dome stretches upward into the Roman sky, let us remember this. Time moves in cycles. Empires rise and fall. Even saints sleep. But something deeper always remains. Call it grace. Call it mystery. Call it the quiet truth that even in endings there are beginnings. And even in prophecy there is mercy. You've walked with me through centuries now, through corridors of marble and catacombs of shadow, across faded scrolls and whispers carved in Latin. We've passed the grand halls of history and knelt beside stories the world was never meant to remember. But before we part, let's ask the quietest question of all. What isn't the Vatican telling us? Not in malice, not in deception, but in the sacred, deliberate way that some truths are kept, because they are too powerful to be held lightly. It's easy to see the Vatican as merely the Church's administrative center, an old walled city with Swiss guards and rituals steeped in incense and velvet. But at its heart, the Vatican is something stranger. It is a vault of time, a repository for what the world has forgotten or never knew. It holds records of celestial phenomena, star maps drawn before telescopes, accounts of angels seen on battlefields, letters from saints written in tongues no linguist can identify, and shelves of ancient artifacts, some never studied, some never named. We've heard rumors the Spear of Destiny pieces of the true cross books bound in languages older than Latin, mirrors that were said to show not reflections, but intentions, and perhaps most curiously of all, doors, rooms that remain locked for centuries, not because no one has the key, but because someone long ago decided no one should open them again. In the secret archives now officially called the Apostolic Archive, there are said to be over 50 miles of shelving. Only a fraction is accessible to researchers. The rest, reserved, restricted, silent. Why? Some say the Church fears what it might reveal: alternate gospels, forbidden teachings, buried scandals. Others suggest it's out of reverence that some documents were never meant for eyes, only for eternity. But perhaps it's simpler still. Perhaps the Church guards these secrets because it knows how fragile belief can be. Faith, after all, is not born of certainty. It's born of mystery. And the moment you unravel the final thread, the moment you explain every miracle, decode every symbol, illuminate every shadow, faith becomes science, and wonder disappears. Still, some mysteries remain too large to stay buried. There are unanswered questions about lost civilizations, ancient technologies, even hints in Vatican correspondences about entities not of this world, references to lights in the sky, voices that spoke from clouds, and visitors cloaked in fire. The Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest in the world, still scans the heavens. But what exactly is it watching for? And why did Pope Francis recently say that if an alien asked to be baptized, he would say yes? Joking or not, the statement leaves a trace. Because perhaps behind all the gold and incense, the Vatican's greatest secret is not about relics or ruins, but about possibility. The possibility that the divine is bigger than doctrine, that God's voice echoes not just in scripture, but in stars, in strange symbols, in quiet apparitions. That maybe, just maybe, we have not yet understood how vast the sacred truly is. There's beauty in that, a gentle terror too, but mostly wonder. Because what the Vatican holds isn't just a history of power or theology. It holds our human need to make sense of the unknown, and sometimes to protect it. So tonight, as this journey draws to a close, sit for a moment in silence. Breathe with the weight of centuries on your shoulders. Let your thoughts drift to those locked rooms, not to pry them open, but to honor them. To imagine what truths might rest inside a sealed box, a forgotten codex, a confession never spoken aloud. To walk through time with your mind and know that even in the age of information, some things still resist explanation. And maybe that's a gift, because if everything were known, what would we dream of? So when the Vatican sleeps, it does so not in ignorance, but in guardianship. It dreams alongside us. It hides some things not to deceive, but to preserve the fragile thread between knowing and believing. And in that quiet, something sacred survives, something soft and glowing, a mystery that will not be solved tonight or tomorrow or ever, not by popes, not by scholars, not even by time, but by wonder, by faith, by the courage to let a question remain open like a book still being written. So rest now. You've walked far, you've listened well, and the Vatican, it remains. Behind stone walls and sealed doors, it keeps its stories. But now, you carry them too, not as answers, but as echoes. And maybe that's all we were ever meant to hold.